Close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. But I would say on a deeper level, it's more like when we say work on yourself. That involves all kinds of like things about moving your life forward. And they struggle with
motivation in these things.
It's because when I don't think I'm worth it, I'm not worth fixing.
When you develop empathy and compassion for other people, there's going to be room for someone else in the relationship. And then this in turn is going to reduce the feeling of being an object. Now two people can connect. And now it's not about getting your needs met in starvation. It's about two human beings forming a relationship.
Alrighty, chat, let's get started. Okay, so we were streaming with Pirate Software Thor. Sorry, I just got out of the shower. And the universe decided that this is not to happen. I lost power a couple of times, and we'll talk about this more with Thor. And it's really interesting because anyway, we'll get to what happened later in the day. But we're going to pick up where we left off, basically, from Monday's conversation. And, yeah. So before we, hop right in, I just want to remind y'all that we have and we'll kind of just recap with him, okay? So it's kind of weird. But we'll recap with him and sort of see, what he wants to finish talking about because, I just whipped out the iPad and then that kind of fell apart. Before we get into that, though, just a quick reminder that we do have our Mental Health Awareness Month challenge that is running right now. So this is Make It May. So every week we're going to give you all tasks to perform. And these tasks are solely for our benefit here at Healthy Gamer. No, kidding. They're actually primarily for your benefit. So this is what we get, and this is what y'all get. So when you complete the tasks, so these are things like week 1 will have stuff like, I forget, like it's about, week 1 was about setting goals and executing on them. Week 2 is about building relationships. Week 3, I think, is about self-expression. And week 4 is about making the world a better place. So as community members do the stuff, we will accumulate points as a community. And then there's certain like stretch goals. So at 1 million points, which I really hope we get because I really want to do this, I will review pickup artists. So we're going to do a pickup artist. I guess we'll talk about relationships and stuff like that. Oh my God. The hair is so wet. But in order to do that, you guys need to improve your lives. So if you guys want to see Dr. K do that, you have to, like, I don't know, accomplish your goals and form meaningful relationships and create self-expression, which we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So definitely check it out. But without further ado, we'll hop in. So, and just a reminder that although I am a psychiatrist, nothing on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. And if y'all have a medical concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. So I'm going to call Thor. And yeah, we will just say that again. Okay, so let me see. And let's call... Oh my God, those are such gigantic mushrooms. Holy Jesus. All right, so we're going to do this. We're going to see if we can find Thor.
Dr. K.
Thor Lord.
All right, I'm going to raid you.
Okay, go for it.
All right, guys, we are ending the stream. I'm going.
Okay. You still seem a little loud. You're so loud and manly, Thor. Okay.
I've completely lost all of my sanity on this stream. You have no idea. It's been amazing.
What do you mean?
It's an incredibly deep puzzle game, and every single time there was a solution to a puzzle, it was insane. And chat was like, "There's no way it could be that," and then it was that. We learned how to read binary off of the ears of rabbits. Like, the puzzles are incredibly deep.
Let me see. Oh.
All right, there we go.
There we go.
All right, there we go.
Can we get camera?
Yeah, I'm
Lights,
trying to switch it all over. Let me turn off and then turn on my OBS because it fully exploded earlier. One of the things that I had to do was launch anyway. One of the things that I actually had to do was change my system time, and it invalidated all of my logins and blew up OBS. It was great.
Why did you have to change your system time?
You get a groundhog to come out of the ground in this game.
Oh, interesting.
So I had to change it. I had to change it to Groundhog Day.
So it's like one of those not prawn puzzle games?
Pretty much. It's called Animal Well. It was actually just published by... Here, let me put this up. Virtual camera should be up now. Is that working? I don't know if that is now.
I don't see you yet.
One moment. Turn on camera.
There we go.
Hey.
There you are.
Yeah, so it was actually published by Big Mode. It's made by a solo developer and wickedly interesting. It's called Animal Well. And people told me, like, oh, it's kind of a neat puzzle game. And I was like, all right, I'll get into it because I like puzzle games. And this is so ridiculously deep. It's so absurd, frankly.
Yeah, I was amazed. So I played Not Prawn back in the day. And, like, yeah. I couldn't get past, like, level 14 or something. And people were, like, finding level 260 whatever. And
yeah, I mean, that was, like,
I was
old
blown
school
away.
puzzle stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it, man.
There was something where you had to, like, visit some URL. And, like, the URL is, like, code. And you have to, like, download the file. Like, it's not clear that it is a file. And then it turns out it's an MP3. But the MP3 had to be played backwards and then sped up to, like, get whatever the next, like... what the password is or something insane. And it was It was crazy.
yeah.
Like I don't know how people figure that stuff out.
So I actually build stuff like that. I have since I started going to DEF CON, way back at DC 22, which I think was like 10 years ago at this point. But yeah, no, I build those types of puzzles for the community. So like finding games like this that have them where I get to be a player in it for once, where I get to be the solver is just it's great.
How do you decide what is too hard? Because it
yeah.
it feels to me like you can just increase like you can keep on adding on layers of difficulty that no one will be able to solve, is my thought. Like that's how I think, but maybe that's Dunning-Kruger.
The best way that I see it is if you think it's too hard, it's not, because there's going to be a lot of people working together to solve it, right? Even the creator of Animal Well likely didn't think people were going to rip through the game this fast, right? But you've given a puzzle challenge to people, and that will naturally attract people that are better at doing super deep puzzle challenges, people like me. That's what I like to do. And as they get better and better at these, they find more and more games like this, and they just keep getting better, so they solve these things fast. Then you get a community of them together, and they just rip it apart. They will destroy it so quickly. Like I'm building one right now inside of a game called Hack Mud with a friend of mine named Eva. And we're trying to make it very hard, but I know they're going to beat it in like a day. No matter what I throw at them, they're just going to rip it to shreds, right? So you always want to make it harder, but there's a kind of difficulty that's important. It needs to have logical tie-ins. So you can't have the player doing what's called a flying leap, where it's like, oh, they just have to guess the answer. Like, no, it needs to logically make sense. You need to be able to lead to that answer. You may think of something really esoteric, something really weird, something like kind of hidden knowledge, but it needs to logically make sense. A lot of what I like to do is make a puzzle that once they solve it, they look back and they go, oh, that makes so much sense now. I don't know how I didn't see that in the first place, right? That's the kind of interaction you want to have. Not what the hell was that? Like, why is it that thing?
That's so interesting, because that reminds me of like psychotherapy.
What? Really? How?
Yeah, because like so what you want to help people do, and not just psychotherapy. I think like just disciplines of growth, like personal growth. So like I did this back with my guru back when I was 21 too, where like there's logical tie-ins to your behavior. So like it doesn't make sense to you until you sort of figure it out, and then once you figure it out, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And so that's so interesting. And I think a lot of the process of psychotherapy is like the formalized process of creating those logical leaps for someone so that they can go from point A to point Z. And even though point Z may feel so far away and so esoteric, like we kind of help people get there, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of an issue. Like I've never actually thought about that sort of a tie-in, right?
Yeah.
It also kind of teaches people to rely more on themselves and their own ability to work and adapt through challenges, which I think is really important. That's something that it taught me going through that stuff, especially, going through DEF CON that way. I think it was awesome, frankly, because it taught me like, oh, hey, I can work through any challenge, even ones that no one else knows what the hell is going on. But like, if I can see it, the solution to it, then I can keep going. And it's funny because we were playing it all day today. We were playing Animal Well all day today. And it's just, those puzzles are crazy deep. Like, there was moments where chat's like, what are you doing? And I was like, there's so much happening, right? It's just this giant wall of math and bullshit all over the screen,
Yeah, sounds super cool. I was never great at those, but maybe I just didn't try enough. Who knows?
They're hard. They're not easy.
Yeah.
And I think you have to like really want that sort of a thing. Not everybody wants that kind of challenge. That's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's a very specific kind of challenge for a person that specifically likes that kind of challenge, right? Yeah.
I'm more of a degenerate MOBA player or single player strategy games.
I feel that.
Maybe the occasional RTS.
Yeah.
But I just don't have the reflexes or training anymore.
Yeah. No, and I mean, it kind of falls away, right? I know that I'm not as good at games as I was 10 years ago, but I'm definitely I'm better at puzzles now, so I can just keep hammering those.
So Thor, I know we got our last conversation got truncated by the universe, and we tried twice. And the really funny thing is that that evening there's a book that I have which is a commentary on this text called the Shiva Sutra.
Okay.
And I got this book back in 2003, and it's been sitting on my shelf for about so 20 years, like 21 years. And so about 3 months ago, I pulled it off the shelf because I was preparing a lecture on something, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll like take a crack at this. But I had 6 books that I was going to go through, and the first 3 or 4 books were sufficient to prepare the lecture, so it was sitting on the shelf. And then, so our stream ended, and that evening I was like, okay, so like let me just read this book because I've never actually like read it, or I tried to read it and it was too dense for me. And it's really interesting because it actually talks a lot about what we were talking about. And so I thought it was like quite coincidental. And then the part of my brain that looks at a cloud and sees a dog that generates patterns out of randomness made me really wonder in like kind of like a spooky way. I was like, oh, maybe I was supposed to read this thing before I talked to you. And so maybe we can I'll ask you kind of where we left off and what you remember. But
I hope that your power doesn't explode this time.
I don't think it will. So I think now that I have prepared by reading the Shiva Sutra, and I've also like looked at I've got a couple of research articles pulled up. So hopefully we can kind of pick up where we left off, but also like if that doesn't, if we kind of lost the thread of it, so be it. But can you just remind us and help me remember kind of where we were in the conversation and what we were about to embark on?
We were talking about something. I'm trying to remember the very specific thing because it's tough for me when like a thread gets severed like that to return to that. We were talking about a very specific thing.
Okay.
I can't remember.
So
I can't remember the
here's
exact
what I
one.
remember.
Sure.
So we were talking about the way that I recall the conversation is we talked a lot about different things that you were doing.
Yes.
So you're working on the Ferret rescue. There was some gaming thing. I forget what it was.
Game Jam.
Game Jam. And then you have a long-term goal of building a publishing house.
And a clinic.
And a clinic. Clinic for what?
Exotic animals.
Okay.
I'm going to build a veterinary clinic. Yeah.
So those are the things that you're working on. And we had talked a lot about your kind of journey and being homeless for a year. And I think in the past we had talked some about you were in a relationship that kind of, and y'all ended up splitting up.
Yeah.
And you kind of grew a lot through this process. We talked a lot about your relationship with your emotions, how you utilize logic. But then I had kind of tossed out this sense that I had that you are not operating from a place of logic or emotion.
Yes, that was the secret third thing.
The third thing, right?
Not this, not this.
Yes. And so as we try to understand what that is, like we started to explore that, and I offered some answers from a tradition. So that doesn't make it right. So this isn't science, right? This is just like some people sat down and looked at this thing and examined it for a while, and then they came up with conclusions. They didn't all come up with the same conclusions, but many of them came up with the same conclusions. And so I think I just pulled out my iPad and was sort of starting to explain like what that thing is.
Yeah.
Or at least one theory of what that thing is.
And then it detonated.
And
I
then
think
it
that's
detonated.
exactly what it was. That was the specific thing we're talking. It's funny. I couldn't remember it because it was it's nothing anyway.
Yeah. Right. So it's nothing. So, and then the other thing that I know we DM'd a little bit back and forth about, rescheduling and stuff. And then the other thing that you mentioned is that a large part of your community is actually progressing very nicely from like a professional standpoint, right? Like
I've gotten a ton of people that are messaging me, tons and tons of people around the world that are like, I put the things that you said to action and I got an amazing job. And it just keeps happening over and over. There's like hundreds of people that are messaging me, reaching out on Twitter, reaching out on DMs on Discord, which I can't answer all of them. There's just so many. People sending emails and people saying it in chat all the time. It's actually really awesome, frankly, seeing that like those types of actions go to work. And it's a lot of really easy stuff most of the time, but it's things that people don't know when they're first entering the workforce. Like making a resume and a cover letter, they're 1 page long. The way that you handle yourself inside of an interview, little tiny things like that people just don't realize is like super important. And they just kind of end up sending out like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of applications. And then they change the stuff and they're like, oh, I got a job two applications later. It's like, yeah, way faster.
So that's awesome. And I think you had mentioned to me in DMs that like drive and burnout are major aspects that y'all are kind of dealing with. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, what are you seeing?
Some of the largest trends in people asking me questions usually around drive and burnout. They're like, I don't have drive. I don't have the drive to go and do something. Or I have pushed myself too hard and I'm burning out. Or I love doing this thing so much that I don't want to do it anymore. They don't realize that they're hitting that burnout threshold where they're pushing themselves in a weird way, or like the environment is bad for doing that work, so then they don't want to do it, or they're doing it too many hours a day. Or they're trying to, a really common one is, I want to quit my day job to go do my hobby full time. And a lot of times people don't realize when you do that hobby full time, you now have added a ton of pressure to yourself of like, I need to be financially viable doing this thing now. And now you hate it, right? So like, there's all kinds of stuff like that where it's little things like that all the time. And those are generally the things that I give advice on like how to fix this, because it's super common, crazy common.
Yeah. So here's what I'd kind of imagined for today. And like, this is like, welcome to modify, disagree, completely, go off the rails. So what I was sort of thinking is that, so I think these two things are related. So the first is when we think a little bit about drive and burnout, both of these things are signals from within us. And if we understand...
It's an alarm.
Huh?
A lot of times it's an alarm. It's like, hey, you're doing something that you shouldn't be. This feels bad. And people don't realize that that's an alarm bell going off.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So what I was kind of referring to is that not even the quality of the signal, that it's an alarm, but that this is something that comes from within. So drive and burnout are not necessarily created by the outside world. They are created by something within us. And so I think that the really interesting thing is that I'd love to hear what your advice is for those kinds of cases. And then I think the other thing that we can do is try to better understand your experience of what drives you, what protects you from burnout. And then what I've kind of done is prepare a little bit about like my understanding of kind of this like Eastern concept of the self, which I think is quite robust, quite correct, like even scientifically. And then I think there's also a lot of like cool stuff in understanding drive and burnout from the neuroscience research. And specifically, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of hedonics versus eudaimonics.
I am not.
Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll kind of give you kind of a quick TLDR. So if you look at human happiness, what we call happiness. So happiness is actually a lot of discrete things. So one kind of happiness, and this is something that Aristotle actually, I think, originally coined. So he sort of noticed that there's two kinds of like happiness. There's like fun and pleasure, and then there's a sense of like well-being and satisfaction. And what we tend to find is that if you look at the neuroscience of it, this is an oversimplification, but I tend to find that in a lot of my patients, there's an inverse relationship between the neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin. So what we think of as dopamine is like the pleasure neurotransmitter. So comes from this part of our brain called the nucleus accumbens. So when we use opiates or we play a video game, we get a rush of pleasure. Now, what we sort of know, this is to be disputed, and probably actually what I'm about to say, I'm leaning towards this actually being incorrect, but it's a useful model, is that when we look at people who are depressed, this gets tied in some way to their serotonin levels, or the levels of serotonin transmission. So there's kind of the prevailing theory, which is now being countered by some people like, anyway, we can go into that detail, but that basically like your sense of well-being is governed by like your serotonin. So we know that.
That's why we use SSRIs.
Yes, that's one of the reasons we use SSRIs.
Okay.
Yes. And so what we sort of find, like if you take someone who has an addiction, for example, like they actually get a fair amount of dopaminergic transmission, right? So I'm playing video games all day. I'm using marijuana on a daily basis, but my sense of well-being and happiness in life actually declines. And what we oftentimes find is that people who are working hard and even denying themselves pleasure, right? So like when I'm driven towards, I don't know, like running a game jam or something like that, that is not like a pleasurable activity. It's not fun. I mean, there may be parts of it that are fun, but there's a large like effort investment, but it increases your sense of well-being. So there's this inverse relationship between dopamine and serotonin that once again is really a neuroscientific oversimplification that we can pick apart very easily, but I think it's useful to think about. We also know that just from observational studies and clinical experience and stuff like that, that these two principles can sometimes be, that we have good data about, that if I chase a life of pleasure, I will probably be unhappy, and that finding a life of happiness sometimes involves avoiding pleasure. So that there's good data about, but we don't quite know that the neuroscience lines up. Anyway, so I think this is also really important because when we talk about drive and burnout, I think that a huge part of what I've found as a clinician, we also have like a creator coaching program and a career coaching program where we sort of use some of these principles of like self-fulfillment. People have better outcomes, and they reduce their unhealthy behaviors, which are usually dopaminergic in nature. And oftentimes what we will discover is that drive and burnout come from listening to a particular part of yourself that doesn't consider these kinds of things. So like, I want to become something. I feel like I've fallen behind in life. I need to prove something. And as a result, like, I'm going to push myself, and I'll end up burning out even though I'm like moving towards my goals. So yeah. I don't know exactly how we're going to do this. I don't know if it's going to happen, but like what I was sort of thinking about is we could understand your experience of this third thing and teach people potentially how to operate from that space more. Because I get the sense that you work very hard, you are driven, and you don't burn out. And then we can also lean into your personal advice and your personal experience of like how you've created that. And I am very confident that whatever answers you have, I will be able to provide a framework or research support for whatever you already do.
Makes sense. Yeah, it makes complete sense. I think the biggest thing for me is, yeah, you're right. I don't burn out. Like, people laugh about it all the time. They're like, oh, he's going to burn out. He's going to do this. Because I work 16 to 19 hours a day. I sleep 5 hours a day. I work all day, do all that kind of stuff. But the thing that I found that started that chain to make that possible, I can see the impact of my work. One of the things that I find a lot of the times is when someone's in a workplace and they feel really bad about going to work, sometimes it's the working environment, sometimes it's the people they work with, but very often I found they don't see why their job matters. They don't see what their job does. And you'll see this quite a lot for a lot of weird kind of areas, or maybe they look down on the impact of the work. Let's say you work at fast food and you think your fast food job is worthless because you work at fast food, right? You work in McDonald's or something like that. Some people can see like, hey, working at McDonald's is actually a really positive thing because I'm feeding people and that gets them through the day. And then they feel better about the job. Some people just go, oh, I just work at fast food. It's a dead end job. They feel like garbage about it, right? So like, I think impact is a really big starting point, if that makes sense. And that's usually the first thing that I look for is like, do you see the impact of your work?
Okay.
Most of the time, the people who have burnt out completely are like, no, I don't see the impact of my work at all. And I'm like, okay, now we can work on that piece.
What I'm going to do, Thor, is I'm going to take notes. Okay.
Okay.
And we're going to start. So I'm going to just, so burnout correlates with lack of impact.
That's one. Yeah. I think that's an aspect of it.
And then in your case, the way that Thor avoids burnout is by seeing the impact.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Seeing impact is huge. That's actually one of the reasons I look into analytics for stuff. It is something that gets beyond the idea of having imposter syndrome, right? The little voice in the back of your head that tells you, hey, you know, you shouldn't be doing that, or you're not good enough, or any of this. I see that kind of as a defense mechanism that's overachieving, right? It's sitting there telling you, like, you shouldn't do this because if you do it, you'll fail. And if you fail, then we'll feel bad. So don't do that, right? But in reality, you should do that thing. You should try that thing and see if it works. So I'll usually tell people, like, hey, if you're getting that overwhelming you and it's stopping you from doing things in the first place, it gives you that failure to start, make a bet with it. Say, I'm going to do this for 3 months. I'm going to wait and see. And then we're going to go back and review everything and see if I did better than when I first started. And if I did, then the imposter syndrome's wrong. Because I look at my analytics all the time, because I see all the feedback that people are giving, all the things that people say, how they see how they say the advice is actually helping them through things, I don't have to deal with that because I can see the impact. And that's immediate evidence to say, like, imposter syndrome sit in the corner, right? Because I have evidence that it's not correct. So that goes away. That's the second layer of that. You've got the impact for your work, and then you've also got imposter syndrome being, pushed to the side for that.
Okay.
Trying to think of some other things. Another one is environment for me. I create zones. So I have a zone for actually doing work. I have a zone for when I want to rest. I have a zone for when I want to do entertainment. These are physical areas of my space, right? And I've talked to people in the past. They're like, "Well, I don't have any areas." I was like, "Do you got a couch?" They're like, "Yeah." I was like, "Do you got a laptop?" And they're like, "Yeah, I do stuff on a laptop." It's like, okay, when you're playing games, sit on the left side of the couch. When you're working on something, sit on the right side of the couch. The reason that I learned that is because I was trying to do everything from a laptop in bed. And what I found was when I was working on things, I wanted to go to sleep. And when I wanted to go to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about work. And it created this like weird mixed thing for me. I don't know if that's the same for everyone, but for me, environmental mixing was a problem. And I had to separate environmental areas to make sure that I was focused on the task for that area, if that makes sense.
So Thor, when you see analytics that are not going well, what happens within you?
I want to know why. I'm not upset. I just want to know why. Like, and I try to form a number of different possibilities for that, things that could be the solution to that. And then I try to isolate those in a way where it is possible for me to test it. So,
okay, I'm going to jump in for a second.
Sure.
So, why don't you feel bad?
Because it's a chance to learn something. And then I can use that for every other situation. If I can solve why that thing went wrong and then use it to my advantage, use, the information from that to my advantage, I can win not only that situation, but many others that come beyond it.
Okay. All right, cool. Is it okay if I interrupt you?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So we're going to map this out and we're going to try to we're going to do everything that you're already doing. We're just going to provide some support for it. Okay. So, you mentioned environment. Okay. What drives you?
A lot of different things. It really depends on the situation, though. I think different situations have different driving factors, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's not always the same. I think there is probably the greatest drive for me, as we were talking about puzzle games earlier, the drive to solve is a pretty big one for me.
Okay.
I love to solve things. And the reason why is because it's like, oh, I don't know that thing. Let me see if I can learn something from this. Because I found that there's so much kind of like cross-pollination between things that you learn, and you can apply those skills anywhere else in your life. And it makes me more adaptive, I find.
Okay. All right. So now we get a little bit potentially into the weirder area. So we had talked about. So here's Thor. And Thor has logic. Thor has emotion. Thor has maybe something called personality.
Maybe.
Right? So
no one's proven that yet.
Puzzle solver. Right? So empty husk with a nice head of hair.
Yeah, there we go.
And then there's this like third thing.
The secret third thing.
The secret third thing, right? And I get the sense that a lot of your drive, so here's what I think the order of operation is. Here's you. The third thing starts, and then what happens is it sends signals to your logical mind, and it sends signals to your emotional mind. And then what these things do is they structure your activity. So these will give this thing, which is formless, they will give it some kind of shape. And then this shape is very dependent on you. Like someone else may have this drive, but based on your desire to solve puzzles, based on the logical conclusions, based on certain values that you hold, it gives this thing a particular manifestation that suits you. And since this thing is suiting you, this leads to success.
And the more things that I learn, the more ways I can make that happen in different scenarios.
Sure. So then what happens is that so the more that these things get enhanced, I'm going to call learning. I'm going to say that learning is over here. Right?
Makes sense.
So then what happens is if you get this kind of impulse and your logic is insufficient, then you can't give this thing shape. But as your logic improves, as your emotions improve, this thing starts to take shape. As we're leveling this up, getting rid of this.
the big thing for me though is when I see that, when I find one of those scenarios where it's like, I don't know enough to do this, I want to. It's like, oh, this is great. That's another thing to add to the Batman belt, right? That's kind of the way that it feels to me each time I am presented with one of those. And it's funny that all of you guys in chat, you saw me do this all day. You've seen me do this for the last like 3 days in Animal Well. Every time it's like, oh, I don't know what this is. I'm going to do this. It's not even hates not knowing things. It's that I know that at the other side of that, when I finish knowing the thing, I'm going to have new ideas that I can apply to other situations. So like solving all those puzzles in Animal Well, I'm going to go make some really cool ARG stuff. I can make that for Heartbound. I can make that for the Hackmud stuff that I'm doing. Anything else, I can apply that all over the place. And I can solve other puzzles in the future. Yeah.
So, Thor, was there a time where you weren't like that?
I don't think there was a time where I wasn't like that. I think there was a time when I wasn't that good at it. It's like a snowball. It's like an avalanche, right?
Okay.
So like there was a time where it was like, God, I don't know anything. I'm just pissed all the time. And it was like, once I started to get a couple of footholds on that, where it's like, wait, I know how to do this. Wait, I can apply it this way. Wait, I can try this way. Then it was like, well, I know how to solve a lot of things, but I don't know how to talk to people. And I'm not good at that. You know?
What do you do when you feel a negative emotion? So you said you used to be pissed. What happens to that emotion?
I think when I was younger, it was a lot harder to manage because emotions kind of came out of nowhere. And it was like really, really kind of rough, you know? Because I think growing up, and I'm sure a lot of people can understand this. Growing up, there was like, don't be over emotional, you know, you're a guy, you know, suppress that sort of a thing. So for me, when I was younger, it was a lot of that. It was a lot of like, be a manly man. Don't do that. Don't show that off. And then as I got older, it was like, no, it just makes sense to do that. It's fine. And I kind of evolved out of that, if that makes sense. So I think that made it more difficult to handle that side of things in the early days. But over time, I realized that was okay. And it made it
how
easier.
did you evolve out of it? Do you know?
It's funny because it keeps going back to that sort of inflection point of homeless for a year, right? I think it was like the most devastating thing that could happen, and it was a hard reset for me, frankly.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, who did you think you were before you were homeless?
I had a very kind of grand vision of myself, way grandiose, way larger than life, frankly, in an absurdist sort of way. I thought I was top of the world. I thought I was kick-ass all the time. And it humbled the shit out of me, frankly. It's the best way to put that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, do you have any questions for me so far?
No, I think this is cool so far.
Okay. So now
It's interesting to see like my whole mental process.
Yeah.
listed
Oh,
out on
yeah.
my whiteboard,
So
you know?
I think what we're gonna do is like what we're gonna do is use you as a test case to generalize certain principles of the mental process, and we're gonna see if we can figure out the code that results in some kind of like outcome, right? So like if I'm like typing "hello world" or whatever, there's something I can type and we can get a particular outcome.
Sure.
So tell me.
I do.
Yeah.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I do think it was not just that moment, though. It's every time I failed ever as well.
Sure.
Every time I ever experienced failure in the ideas that I had, it showed me there's something more to learn. And then eventually it's like, you don't know anything. You just know the things that you already know. And you can use those to adapt yourself to different situations and become better at discerning things and better at evolving through that.
Okay.
My whole thing was like, train yourself to adapt no matter what.
Okay.
And failure is great because it gives you another chance to learn a new adaptation.
Okay. So I'm going to point something out to you.
Sure.
When some people fail, they say, I am bad. And
Oh,
when
absolutely.
you fail, what do you say?
I say, ooh, piece of candy. You know, it's like, it's an opportunity for me.
Opportunity for what?
To learn. It's an opportunity to get better.
Okay. So I'm going to just keep track of this. Okay. We'll see if we can suss out what the big difference is. So actually, maybe we can do it now. What do you think is the object of this thought?
Object meaning, can you define?
Yeah. So where is in what it's going to be hard to, but I'll keep trying,
Sure.
and then you can puzzle solve your way to the answer. What is my mind looking at when I have this thought?
Short term.
Okay.
I generally think that that is a very short term sort of feeling. It is, I failed here, which means I am a failure, rather than I failed here, but look at all the things that I've overcome in my life. I don't remember all the really difficult things that I've gotten through to get to this point. I survived to here. So it's a short term, like, this happened, so I suck. It's like, no, all the other stuff that you learned, you rock, actually. The fact that you are here, that you've made it this far, means you've succeeded.
Okay. So I'm gonna translate that into certain terminology. So I'm gonna say that when you say, like, okay, people only see this one thing, right? So they kind of don't take the big picture. Like, they don't think about all the things that they've done. I'm gonna call that zoomed in.
Yeah.
Okay. So this thought is zoomed in. This thought is short term.
Yep.
I'm gonna go ahead and say that the object of this thought is your identity. So I am thinking about me.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You're thinking about yourself rather than the situation.
Yes.
I could see that.
So when you have this thought, what is the object? What am I looking at?
The problem itself, for me.
Okay.
I guess,
so the problem.
and the future rather than the present. It is, I'm focusing on the goal, which is when the problem is already solved.
Okay.
It is more of a long-term thing as well, because it's like, this is an opportunity for growth. It may be difficult to get through this, but at the end of this, I'm going to be way more suited to solving stuff like this, and whatever it's going to be. And I think I learned a lot of that from being a programmer, as funny as that is.
How
because
so?
Programming is 99% fixing your own bugs, frankly. Like, you are constantly making assumptions, trying something, seeing that it fails, trying to find out why it failed, getting better at that thing, and then you can see the progress as your code stops failing as much, or it starts to fail in new and more fantastic ways, frankly.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting because, once again, I'm like reminded of this analogy when you kind of say, like, 99% of it is solving your own bugs. Like, I think that's what growth is too. So personal growth, whether it's through, kind of the yogic path or the psychotherapy path, I think that there's overlap there.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is basically, I think a lot of people really don't realize that actually they control so much. And
They do.
And even if we look at the way that you respond to failure, right? So, like, what I've sort of noticed is that there are two types of people in the world: those who what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and those who what doesn't kill you cripples you for life. So this is the sad truth, is that a lot of people say, oh, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. That's not true. What doesn't kill you can just cripple you for life as well.
That's one of the reasons why I try to give people that feedback of, like, you need to find the impact in your work, because I found, for me, that was my first foothold. That was the first, like, wait, I'm not terrible. I'm not shit. I have evidence now. It's like finding a sword, right? Because you can finally fight back at that point. You're like, I have evidence that I'm doing something that matters. And that's, when you have nothing, that's a really empowering thing.
Yeah, so I think that there are things that make it difficult for people to do that.
Oh, definitely.
Right?
I do think it's incredibly hard, especially when you don't have anything to start off with. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of people have something. I think they have difficulty seeing that they have something.
I agree with that. Yeah.
What do you think makes it hard for them to see that they have something?
I think a lot of times it's easy to kind of fall into that path of seeing all the negative patterns, seeing that path of, I failed here, I failed there, I failed this, I failed that, and not being able to see the positive things. I'm interested in what leads someone down that sort of path, because it's quite interesting, because it's exactly the same path, but in reverse. It's the same. So I can focus on all of the successes that I have, all the things that I can do, all the things that I've learned from those failures, or I can focus on all the times that I failed and keep that as the focal point. The interesting part to me is what leads someone down one of those paths versus the other one.
Let's talk about
what does that. Yeah.
So, what do you understand about this third thing, the nethi thing? Like, can you toss out anything? So, like, I use the word calling, and I think that was the term that kind of resonated with you.
It is. Yeah, 100%.
Like, how do you understand, like, what is that? Where does that come from? Just give me anything that you've got about it. And if you've got nothing, that's totally fine, too.
I don't even think it's nothing. There's a moment that I have where it's funny. Some people will talk about it like intuition or you know, gut instinct or anything like that, whatever it's going to be. But it really comes down to I'm in a scenario and I go, this is the right way to handle this. And then I go, how do I logically handle this? How do I emotionally handle this? Can I do that? Is it within my ability to do so? How is that going to affect everyone around me? Does everyone win when we do this? And it starts cascading down all the possibilities of the different routes of ways that this could be handled, pieces that I could touch, how the puzzle gets solved. Where do all the puzzle pieces lay? And does it hurt anyone along the way?
Okay.
That's the biggest one.
So here's what I want to point out to you.
But that first piece is just...
Yeah. So the right answer precedes the logic.
Yes, that is correct.
How does that work?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
I got nothing on that one.
So this, if people want to understand why they are burnt out, if you can understand this, that the right answer comes first, then all kinds of problems will be solved. So let's like talk about a couple of different problems that arise from not knowing what the right answer is. So the first simplest example is like want versus should. Right? So like, let's say you've got someone who's like, okay, like I'm unhappy in my career or I'm unhappy with something. It doesn't matter what, relationship, career, job, whatever. And then what happens is that logic and emotion enter the picture. There's no North Star to begin with. And then logic and emotion fight. Okay? So emotion says, I want to do this. I don't want to work. I don't want to do this. I want to play video games. And then logic says, but I should play video games. And then there's internal conflict. And then we get to this really interesting principle of ambivalence. So human beings are conflicted in their nature, or not actually in their nature, but in the psychology of understanding human behavioral change. This is what we've sort of figured out. Human beings are ambivalent. So right now I have like a plus minus over here, and I have a different plus minus over here. So this may sound kind of weird, but I'll explain. So like if I move... so anytime I have a conflict, there are benefits of doing what I want, and there are costs of doing what I want, and there are benefits of doing what I should do, and there are costs of doing what I should do. So we start in the middle, and the interesting thing is as you move in one direction, this becomes small, and the costs start increasing. It doesn't matter which direction you move in. Anytime you move towards an action, this is what the science of ambivalence tells us. Let's say like I think about do I want to play a video game or do I want to go to the gym? And if I go to the gym, like what happens is the thought of going to the gym and the experience of going to the gym are different. When I'm thinking about going to the gym or I'm thinking about eating a salad, once I sit down to eat the salad, I have to eat the salad. So the actual...
it's like I'd love to be healthy, but now I got to eat salad.
Right.
And you got to go and actually do the action. Yeah.
So this is what's really interesting is that if you look at it, like as we move towards something, the costs start increasing. Our brain starts to experience, there's a hypothetical cost of going to the gym, sure. But once I'm actually there and like I'm feeling intimidated by people and I'm feeling like all these people are in shape and they're judging me and all that kind of stuff, the cost actually increases. So then what happens is as the cost increases, the grass is greener on the other side, right? This also explains this very simple principle of why the grass is greener on the other side. Then people end up moving over here. And as they move over here, oh, now I moved a little bit over here, and it turns out that the grass is not greener on the other side. I'm breaking up was a mistake. Let me see if they'll take me back. And then people sort of end up stuck.
You just kind of,
So this is what's super, super crazy. Is that operating from emotion and logic, which is what a lot of people try to do, doesn't work very well. What actually works incredibly well is figuring out what your North Star is, and logic and emotion are not determinants of your behavior. They are tools to actualize whatever your compass is. This is what we see in you.
that ends up being a strong sense of self.
Okay.
But why? Where does...
Let's talk about that. What do you mean by strong sense of self? Great.
Because the only way you can find that North Star at that point is that means a strong sense of self that says, regardless of the logical of the situation, regardless of the emotion of the situation, this is the thing that I think is correct. So from there, how do we logically handle this and how do we emotionally handle this to make sure that that becomes the end goal, like becomes the outcome, right? And that just ends up being a really, it's a strong sense of self, which is funny because most people on the internet just go based, right? But like that's what it sounds like to me is what we're describing here.
Yes. So here's the first principle to understand. And there's a big problem that we see in our society right now. Logic and emotions are tools. They're to be utilized by the self. They should not run your life. And what we tend to find is people who are overly logical. First of all, there's all kinds of problems with that. People think they don't realize that there's problems. But so the first thing is like logic. The more logical you are, the more prone you are to things like depression. And when your emotions run the show, I think we can all agree that that's like not a good plan. And the basic problem with logic is that logic is not really logical. Like, so in the human brain, when you take this abstract principle of logic and you apply it to the human brain, you're going to have all kinds of selection biases, right? So I don't have space. So when people say that, they do have space, but their brain isn't, their logic is not able to see that because there is something within your mind that is obscuring information from your logical apparatus.
Makes sense. Actually, that kind of reminds me, have you played, oh God, what is that game? I'm going to look this up while you're talking.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to show you this. Anyway, keep going.
Okay.
Disco Elysium. There we go. Thank you.
I played a little bit of Disco Elysium. Absolutely loved it.
So I thought Disco Elysium actually ties into this quite well because in Disco Elysium, you have traits to your character. And those traits turn into intrusive thoughts. But the intrusive thoughts are based on those statistics. So if you have encyclopedic knowledge because your intelligence is very high, you may be able to recollect things. Like you remember things when you're talking to people about different stuff in the world, but also it may cut in and be like, you shouldn't listen to that person. They don't know anything. They're an idiot. And it's very interesting because that's exactly what it is you're seeing the logical side do something that isn't logical and kind of push them away from that scenario. It's quite odd.
I remember just one really interesting thing about the game. So I was playing the game, and in the game, there's someone who talks about prion disease and familial fatal insomnia. So they're like, they don't name the things. But I was reading this, and I was like, this is really interesting because this sounds like familial fatal insomnia, which is a really like rare case. Like it's like a very rare disease, and it is familial fatal insomnia, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an inherited condition where you lose the capacity to sleep and you go crazy and then you die. And one of the nice things about training at some of these some of these institutions, so I trained at a very famous hospital, and the cool thing about training at a famous hospital is like you get people like there's like maybe 5 cases of this a year across the globe, and so like people will fly to like very specialized hospitals to get this kind of care for these diseases, which is really bad, really scary thing, very exceedingly rare. So you don't need to worry about it.
For each one of them, maybe you get closer to fixing it.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe closer to a solve, yeah.
Okay, so Disco Elysium is absolutely full of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So let's go back to this. So now I'm going to ask you a question, Thor. So you said it comes from the self. So basically, what we're going to help people do is understand what you've managed to do so that you can operate from that place. The other really interesting thing is that, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but when you're operating from the self, you can know that this is logically a bad idea. You can know that this is emotionally not a good thing, and then you can still do it. Does that make sense?
And I can find a way to make it work.
Exactly.
That's the big one.
Right? So, so this is the cool thing is that normally what happens is we are bound by our logic and our emotions. Our ability, our capacity for self-determination can be restricted by logic. So my mind is telling me this is a bad idea. Like I do this stuff all the time. And it's kind of weird, but someone asked me recently, like, what is something that I wish I knew when I was 30? And my answer was to walk away from good things. That like some of the best things, some of the best decisions in my life are to walk away from quote unquote objectively good opportunities. And so we have this idea when we're 30 that, we have to we're still following the script of the world, and we don't realize that the script of the world doesn't translate over into us, and that some of the best decisions I made are to walk away from objectively great opportunities.
Interesting.
And so logically, it doesn't sound, it's stupid, but you do it anyway. And then it turns out it works great because maybe then you're in alignment with the universe or whatever the fuck. Anyway, so
I think the interesting part about that is if you're doing that, you're choosing to have more hardship, which means you're choosing to have more scenarios in which you can adapt and learn to adapt better, which is going to make long term to make it easier, frankly.
theoretically, yes, that is one way to look at it. But the other way to look at it is if you get an amazing job opportunity from a great institution, generally speaking, people will say, sure, you may not, I mean, you can adapt there too, but I think that like there's certain things that are viewed as right answers in life, which I don't think is the case, and that's the whole point. But
makes sense.
What I'm kind of going to zero in on and tunnel down on is like if you're someone who is struggling in life with burnout or drive, you cannot come up with an answer from logic or emotion. Or if you come up with that answer from logic or emotion, if you start to implement it, it is going to, the experience is going to be like this, which is not unsolvable. You can get through that. But generally speaking, logic and emotion are not great places to operate from. That's my belief. That's a statement of belief I'm making.
It's funny. I was actually just thinking about it. There's people that every once in a while I get a question like this where they're like, should I have this job or should I take this job? And I'm like, which job do you want to take? And the moment you ask somebody that, they sit there and they go, you know, I never asked that of myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So they're operating from a place of logic or emotion instead of operating from a place of self. Now, I've got a question for you. So you said this comes from you.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that you had a grandiose version of yourself in your mind. What is the relationship between the grandiose version and self? In your,
I think the grandiose
it's whatever
version of
answer you
myself
come
is
up
that.
with. Okay, I'm just curious. You know.
I think the grandiose version of myself when I was younger, the fatal flaw that I had with that was I can do anything and it doesn't matter. I can do anything at all, and it wouldn't matter. I don't need to think about it. I can just do it. Who cares, right? And that doesn't make any damn sense because when I did that, I didn't know why I succeeded. I didn't know why I failed, and I didn't care, and I learned nothing from it, frankly. And I found that to be it's kind of like gambling, frankly. You're just gambling the whole time, and you're not learning anything from it, so you don't get any long-term benefits from that. You just get kind of the luck of the draw, frankly, because you're just throwing things at the wall and you're not even seeing what sticks. You're just throwing things constantly.
Okay, that's very useful. We're going to tie that into something in a second. Sure. But when you say grandiose version of yourself, I'm curious, what is so like you have this voice inside you, right? Sure. That says this is right. Yep. And then, by the way, can you see what I'm screen sharing with you?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
yeah, I can see it all.
And what is the relationship, right? So like I can come up with, I can keep on using language and framing this because what I'm asking is kind of confusing. What is the relationship between, like, what is that? What is the grandiose version of the self? And this is right. Like this is right comes from the self, and then you have the grandiose version of the self. Are these the same thing? Are these different things? Like how do you understand this? And if you don't, that's perfectly fine because I'll offer a hypothesis.
I would say those are different things.
Okay.
And I think that there's a little bit of that in there. There has to be. You have to be strong enough to say, this is right, regardless of any other pieces that may come after that, like logic and emotion telling you, no, this isn't right, right? It's the driving force. It's the one that says, this is what we're doing. Let's use everything else as a tool set to make sure that happens. So there is a little bit of like kind of domineering aspect to that, right?
Okay.
But it's not... I guess the best thing to say there is it got tempered. So before I went homeless, it was just like, yeah, we're just going to do it. Who cares about the consequence? Who cares about how it affects anybody else? Who cares about how it affects me later? It's going to work right now, so who cares, right? And that changed completely. Now it's like, okay, we're going to do this. How do we do it in the right way? That was the big shift between those two things. How do we do it in the way that actually benefits the most for everybody?
Okay.
That was the difference.
So now I'm going to offer a couple things. The first thing is I want you to notice this statement and this statement. What do you notice about these two statements?
They're pretty polar opposite.
That's absolutely true. And I would say that they are very similar, because what is the object of this statement?
It's I. Yeah.
Right? So this is where a lot of people get mixed up. We look at this and we see that this is at the end and this is at the end, and these two things are opposites. And if this one is bad, then this one must be good. But it turns out that the yogis would say, no, 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 no. Both of these statements are equally bad.
Yep.
So now we get to the true nature of self. So deep within you, you have Thuriya, the self, the Atman, the soul. I don't know what this is, right? So this is Neti Neti. You have a voice within you. Some people call it divinity.
Yep. It's described as kind of a divine force, things like that.
Yeah. And there is some transcendental quality. Now, if we want to take a biological reductionist perspective, we say nothing like this exists. And this is simply subconscious processing or unconscious processing.
You could say that, yeah.
Okay. I personally don't believe that, but that I think is a very scientifically valid argument, because not only does this thing have no words that can describe it, it has no capacity to be measured.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So science will never detect this, in my opinion.
For me, I don't have an answer there, and I think not having an answer is okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So, and then you can make an argument that it sort of doesn't matter, but we'll get to this a little bit later.
I think it matters greatly. I just don't have an answer.
I think it does. I think it does too. So then what happens is we have this thing called the ahamkara, or the ego. Now, this is where these statements come in. I can do anything. I am bad. And if we ask you, Thor, how did you become the person that you say today? You cite one inflection point, which is a point of basically abandoning your ego, right? So you even use the word humbling, incredibly humbling. So prior to this, you had a very, very powerful ego. And then the humbling, same thing with me, by the way. So I was like pre-med, and I was going to become, I was going to go to Harvard, and I was going to be one of the best doctors on the planet and all this kind of shit. And then like I had a very, very humbling experience over the course of years and years and years, got rid of my ego. And the big irony is I wound up training there anyway, but like I didn't, it wasn't a goal for me then. It was just, it felt right. So now here's a lot of very important things to understand, right? So now that we've entered into the ego, now a couple of things happen. If the ego controls your logic and manages your emotions, then these tools will result in like different kinds of problems. This is also where we see the seed of burnout and drive. So if your drive comes from here, okay? Let me think about how to draw this. So let's say here is the dimension of drive. If your drive comes from here, logic and emotion, okay? What that means is that your drive will be conflicted. Because as the logic changes, as your emotional state changes, the drive will wiffle waffle. This is what ends up with people not truly being stuck. So very few people are stuck in life. Usually what happens with people is they're more like pendulums, where they move 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward. There's a lot of activity, which is why they're so exhausted all the time, because they're actually moving a lot. There's a lot of energy being expended, but the energy is just getting dissipated in 2 opposite directions.
Yeah, it looks like they're standing still, but they're actually working twice as hard as everybody else.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yep.
So if your drive comes from ahamkar or ego, this can lead to a lot of accomplishment. But it will oftentimes lead to unhappiness, a sense of fragility, a lack of contentment. So this is what I see with a lot of people who have things like imposter syndrome, or people who are in banking, and they have this idea, I want to be something one day. So I want to be successful. I want to be respected. I want to be sexy. I want to do this. I. And that can be
used to be me.
Used to be me too.
Yeah.
So that can drive us very effectively. So we'll see a lot of very successful, I'm not going to name names, but I think you can look at like the internet and Twitter, and you can see a lot of people who have a lot of objective measures of success. But if you just pay attention to them, they don't seem happy because they're getting upset about stuff. They're getting into fights with like people, like, you know, they just don't seem content. Like someone who's content,
fighting on social media all the time.
Yeah. Right. So there are people who can let negativity like kind of slough off them like a roof with rain. Like it just, you know, it falls on you and it kind of sloughs off. And then there are people who like really, despite the fact that they're very successful, they don't appear to be content. Yeah. And that's because ego can absolutely drive us and can lead to good outcomes. And this is where a lot of people get confused because they want those things. The problem is that when we're operating from ego and when we're driven by ego, the ego controls the emotion and the logic. So we end up doing things that are not good for us and end up leading to burnout. So for example, let's say I'm a programmer. So we had a great interview maybe about a year and a half ago with someone who was like dealing with a lot of burnout. And this programmer was very successful. And what would happen is like they would go home on the weekend. Like if there was some problem that needed to be solved, this is what they would describe. So they go home on Friday and then they would work on the problem all weekend long. There's a team of developers and then they come in on Monday morning with the solution. So instead of getting a weekend, they do the whole team's work over the course of the weekend. And then they come in burnt out on the weekend, but man, everyone is like, holy crap, this is great. Like, thank you for solving this problem. And they feel so good from that positive enforcement. They have this desire to be, and what we sort of discovered with them is they have the desire to be the hero. Like, I want to be the hero. It feels good to be the hero. But the hero is an aspect of my ego. So what happens when I operate from ego, I want to be something, is it causes us to make, generally speaking, unhealthy trades. So we value something so much and we're willing to sacrifice. I don't want to disappoint my boss. I want my boss to love me. I want my boss to respect me. So I'm never going to set a boundary with them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So
I think a lot of the times that's kind of interesting because I think a lot of the times that's the same sort of traits where it stops you from wanting to do things like take breaks when you really need to or be able to go on vacation. Like one of the things I learned pretty early is I do work a lot. I really enjoy working. But when I need a break, I listen to myself and I'm like, I'm not going to stream today. Today, I'm going to take it chill. I'm going to walk away for a minute because you need to do that. Everybody, no matter how driven you are, you have to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. So I think what happens with the ego is since it almost shapes or even suppresses logic and emotion, it leads to a very selective logic, right? So then the logical part of you that's like, hey, sometimes like you're human and you need a break, that gets suppressed. So what happens is a lot of people will cultivate this, and I see this a lot like on social media in terms of like, you know, this hustle culture and stuff like that like sacrifice is to be lauded. All of these people are operating from ego. And you can it can result in a lot of positive outcomes, like materialistic outcomes, absolutely. But it also leads to a lot of unhappiness and burnout and all kinds of like other negativity.
I had that actually. So when I used to work for the DOE, right, because I worked for the Department of Energy, I made an insane amount of money, right, because I was working for the federal government hacking power plants, right? Crazy well-paid job. But I was flying around the country 10 weeks a year. I wasn't home. And they wanted to change that to 30 weeks a year. And I realized like I could sacrifice everything. I could just have no home life. I could just never be at my house. I could just not have any friends, none of this. And I could make a ton of money doing it. But at a certain point, it was like, that's not worth it. It's absolutely not worth it. I think there might be a time and a place for that to put yourself in an advantageous situation down the line if it's short. But, you know, but not a permanent solution like that. Not something that lasts a super long period of time. I can understand the idea of grinding for a little bit so that you can have yourself in a better situation. But that stuff like that can absolutely take over. At least I felt
absolutely
the draw for that. And I was like, no, I'm not doing it. And
so the challenge, Thor, is that if ego is where they're coming from, they can't draw those limits. Okay. Because if I don't work 30 weeks, then in my mind, I become something else. And I don't want to be that thing. And the avoidance of that kind of thing, like I want to be the hardest worker because the hardest worker means I'm the best, which means that if someone else, and this is all kinds of problems come with ego. One is that a comparison really sets in. So ego by its nature exists to compare. It's one of the fundamental things. So like if I have an identity of I'm the best, what that means is that like if that's my identity and someone shows up who's better than me, then I can't let them do that. So then either I need to work harder or I need to be toxic and try to sabotage them or all kinds of other crap happens. So comparison and ego go hand in hand. And even if we kind of look at some of these, this is kind of confusing for a lot of people, but recently I've been talking about how tall and short are not real things. They are comparisons and they are abstractions. So height is a real thing, absolutely. But tall and short are comparisons. You can't be, if I'm the only human being on the planet, like, and I live on a desert island or I live on an island, there's no other human beings, I won't be tall or short. I will be a certain height, I can do certain things, but other human beings are necessary for tall and short to exist.
That makes sense.
So the
It's
other
an interesting
challenge,
way to see it. I've actually never seen it that way. It's quite funny. But yeah, no,
it's really
makes sense.
wild, right? So and then the people who say this is not correct, Dr. K, will, if you pay attention, they will be operating from ego. I am tall. Here is my experience of tall. Is there a reality of being of not having a particular height? Absolutely. So I can't reach particular things on the shelf. People will judge me. Absolutely. That judgment is 100% real. But this is where things get really tricky. The judgment is real, but the way that I see myself is moldable by me.
I think it's funny because I use that as a point of humor a lot of the times. Like the ridiculousness of being like, oh, short people, tall people. It's like it's a really common silly joke that I tell because I'm 6'2", so it's slightly above the average, right? And it's like it's not that good to be a tall person because you can see where you want to get to, but there's all these short people in the way. And like calling out the ridiculousness of that kind of comparison is like I find that really funny, right? Because it calls to point. It's like it doesn't even matter, right? None of that stuff even matters, but it's funny. It's funny to do that.
So this is where there is a reality. There is a real logic to tall and short, but there is still, if we're operating from the ego, it's never going to be enough. And this is where, like, I've worked with people, and I guess arguably I'm one of them. So I'm like 5'7" or 5'8". I'm confused about that because I think I'm 5'7", and someone else says they're 5'8", and I'm taller than they are. So then I'm like, I don't know anymore.
So
how
compressed
I'm
you are that day, I guess,
5'7" and a half.
Yeah.
And then, and so, but like, you know, I'm okay with that. Like, that's fine with, like, you know, and people will say like, oh, 5'7" cursed. And it's like, you know, that.
To be honest with you.
Yeah.
I think it is frustrating being taller sometimes. Planes suck. Sure. Absolutely. Like legitimately. So I think there's always things that go along with both. And that's why I always found it to be kind of silly. Like it doesn't really matter. Yeah. Because like if you're shorter, some things are out of reach. People will make fun of you. And if you're taller, you're going to hit your head on stuff and you're also not going to fit in a lot of places. Like I have to think about the shape of a car that I want to get into, right? And that sucks. It's awful.
Yeah, I think that there is a logic to that I think a lot of people, because they are operating from ego, will reject. The thought that being tall comes with disadvantages is something that their logic will respond and say, that is insane. There may be some disadvantages, but the advantages far, far, far outweigh the disadvantages.
I mean, it's funny to me because like there's not a lot of advantages to having a tall programmer. You know, like it doesn't really matter for us. It's kind of irrelevant. And
I'm pretty sure there are people out there who would argue with you. They would find some other point of argument. My point is that when things are operating from the ego, this grandiose sense of self, as opposed to Thuriya, which is this transcendent state, which we'll get to, then it can lead to a lot of success, but it will come at a very high price.
Makes sense.
Then there is
I can agree with that. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, honestly.
Yeah. So then there is operating from Thuriya. So Thuriya is this fourth state of consciousness. So if we look at, this is kind of how we can view consciousness, which is awareness. And then we can look at mental activity. And what we find is that we can make a 2x2 table. So there's plus, minus, plus, minus. So when we are aware and we have mental activity, this is what we call wakefulness, right? I'm awake, which means I'm aware that I exist and my mind is functioning. When I have no consciousness and mental activity, this is when I am daydreaming or dreaming. So I lose my sense of awareness, but my mind is operating, right? And it's beautiful that we even call this daydreaming because we figure out that these two states are very similar subjectively.
I get that when I read a book, as weird as that is.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
So when we get lost in something, there is a lot of engrossing mental activity. And then over here is sleep. And over here is, let's call it Thuriya. Or this is where we have consciousness, but we have no mental activity. So this is the goal of meditation, is to move into this place. So this is where, once again, if we think about ego, logic, and emotions, these are things that are part of the mind.
That makes sense.
This is the mind, right? So I have a sense of who I am. I have logical thoughts. I have emotions. Emotions can be physical too, for sure. But the goal of meditation is to move into this place. Now, somewhere along the way, you tapped into this. And this is what's super cool about operating from Thuriya, is that when you operate from this place, like all kinds of cool stuff happens. The first thing that happens is that you have very high reserves of energy.
Yeah.
Okay? So much like you, I work oftentimes 7 days a week. And I won't work 16 to 19 hours a day. I basically can't unless I'm doing clinical work. So I can work like 60-hour shifts at a hospital because I'm constantly seeing patients, but I can't do regular work like that. But what I tend to find is that I tend to run out of energy. Like I have low endurance. So I'll work 7 days a week because that kind of works for me. But you have a lot of reserves of energy. The other cool thing is that you're resilient to setbacks.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Setback is an advantage.
Absolutely. So this is where we go to this, where failure becomes, and even if you think about the term, right? So failure implies the end of something. Setback implies a continuation.
Yeah.
And if we
it becomes
really...
fuel.
Huh?
It becomes fuel.
Absolutely.
That's really what it is.
Right? So this is what's really crazy, is that like, if you think about any event in life, it is neither a failure nor a setback. It is the way in which you conceptualize it, which determines whether this is a failure or a setback. So I applied to medical school for a year, got rejected 40 times. Was that a failure? Like, absolutely. Like, objectively, you could call it that. But it is the attitude that you take. This is an opportunity to learn. We got to keep doing it. Let's keep moving forward. You know, I certainly had these feelings of I am bad. And in my case, I had gone through some degree of formal training, which we'll talk about at the very end today, that helped me move from here to here. But once again, the key thing, if people want to stop thinking this way, this is what they need to eliminate. The I. The I needs to be eliminated. Because if we pay attention to your language, Thor, you do not operate from I. Right? So it's
pretty
like...
rare.
Huh?
It's pretty rare. I mean, I still use the word I.
No, we all use so the ego so the ego eventually, when we do it right, the ego becomes a tool just like logic and emotion. Ego isn't
Makes
bad.
sense.
It is just that we should be aware of like ego and we should not operate from ego. So when you operate from Thuriya, you also get a sense of like direction, right? And then what happens is normally when we get paralyzed by logic and emotion, right? So this kind of business goes away. So what happens is that right now, so there's like two ways of operating. So if I'm over here, and as I move this way, I get more negative. And then what happens is, since I'm trying to do something good, like the reason I moved this way in the first place is because over here, there was a beneficial ratio of like positive and negative. There's neuroscience to this as well. Now that the ratio is unfavorable, I move this way. But now I'm over here. And then I end up doing this. So when you operate from a place of Thuriya, what happens is this negativity becomes an obstacle to overcome. We don't stop moving in this direction. It just becomes a problem to solve. We keep moving in that direction. So then the experience is like this. This is our activation energy.
Friction.
It's friction, but we don't stop moving even though there's friction. So
Yeah,
this
it's kind of funny. It's like it's friction. It's like there's a wall in front of you and you just walk through it.
yeah.
Like you just keep walking
So-
until it's not there anymore.
This is also what gives us follow through. So this is a huge problem in our community right now, like in the world, where people like don't follow through with stuff. And you're not going to follow through
huge one.
if you're operating from logic or drive. You will absolutely follow through if you are operating from what I would call a transcendent space. And by transcendent, I mean a place that is outside of your mind, right? That drive comes from in here. It doesn't come from up here.
Yeah,
And so
it's actually it's funny because we were playing that puzzle game all day today, and basically every time I hit one of those puzzles, it was like a ramp up, and it was like another, because you're hitting all these obstacles, and I see a lot of people fail out of games like that. They put negative sort of emotions to those types of things, and they're like, "Oh, I hate this because the game didn't hand it to me." Ugh. And it's like for me, it's like no, like more, like keep giving more obstacles, please, because that's what drives me for that. It makes it more interesting.
So this is where
I like
there's
challenges.
when I teach that makes so I'll kind of reflect that concept back to you. So there's this concept in Eastern religions, basically spiritual traditions, called dharma. So dharma means duty. And the cool thing about duty is, generally speaking, in life, we try to run away from negative things. So your life would be way easier if you could run towards things that were painful in some capacity. And that's what dharma allows you to do. So if we're operating from logic or emotion or gains or outcomes, it's all about a risk benefit. Our brain even does this action success calculation where it like decides whether something is worth it or not. This is why everyone procrastinates when they're studying for a test, because our brain knows that if we wait until 48 hours and we cram, we can still pass. That's how the brain decides. And it decides that I can study for 2 days or I can study for 2 months. And in one case, I get a C, and in one case, I get an A. And from an actual like hourly calculation, it is more beneficial for me to procrastinate, because a C for 2 days is a way better deal. It's way better value than 60 days of studying for an A.
Yeah.
So when we look at dharma is also what allows us to do hard things. So I don't think you have kids, but I have kids, and the best example that I
ferrets.
Huh?
I have 38 ferrets in a rescue. That's
right. So actually, the ferrets are a good example. So if you think about making sacrifices like staying up or spending your money, if you do it out of a duty to your ferrets, or I do it for my kids because I don't have ferrets, then it makes it easier to stay up late, right? It makes it easier to do the dishes. It makes it easier to do laundry.
It's
it makes
something
it
beyond yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Beyond yourself, right? So once again, dharma allows us to mitigate the strength of the ego. Okay?
Makes sense.
There's another kind of dimension which I want to kind of talk about real quick. I think I'm screen sharing with you, so hopefully y'all can see this.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just toss in a little bit of science because there's some support of these principles. This isn't really a one-to-one. There are other studies which we could talk about, transcendent states of consciousness and psychedelics and ego death and stuff like that. If you want to talk about that, we can.
Oh, yeah. But I dig this.
This is where I want to introduce this concept to people of hedonic and eudaimonics. Let me see if I can find...
I've never heard those terms, actually.
Yeah. So let's take a look at some brain stuff. So what we know is that there are two kinds of things that make people happy. And I think the biggest problem is that when we're operating from ego, so usually when we're operating from our base logic or emotions, this results in hedonics. Now, people may get confused because they're saying, like, logically, isn't it a good idea to... They understand with emotions, like if I gratify emotions, like, yeah, that's like short-term pleasure. But oftentimes our logic is flawed, right? So we'll like logic ourselves, oh yeah, like I can get drunk today, like it's not that big of a deal, like I can do this work tomorrow. That's logical thinking, but it's in a hedonic pursuit. So what I find in people who are highly addicted to stuff is that their like logical brain is actually run by their addiction. They will constantly...
So it's just in relation to hedonism. Right?
Absolutely. So a lot of our logical thinking actually results in a hedonistic lifestyle. And I know that runs contrary to what a lot of people would think. They're like, oh no, emotions are hedonic. And like, if I lived my life logic, that's not actually how it works. If you pay attention to eating that cookie, like your brain will give you logic as to why it's okay.
Yeah. It's always like it is a way of proving to yourself, like, well, it's okay to cheat on my diet this time.
Absolutely.
Because of these reasons. So
Absolutely.
yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. So
that leads to hedonism, for sure.
And people will call that flawed logic, but it is my experience as a psychiatrist that the abstraction of logic and code when put into a human brain is no longer objective. Like, that's just not doable.
I think it's always the first reaction, too. It's not the, well, I should have the cookie. You know, it's like, no, I have to convince myself. I have to give myself a reasoning for why it should be okay.
Right? So your brain will do that.
Yeah.
Like, you'll work really hard to convince the addicted part of your brain will work really hard to convince the other parts of your brain through logic that what it wants is correct.
Do you think we see the same thing in kind of criminal behavior? It's like, I should do this bad thing because of these reasons, so it makes it okay.
Absolutely. Not just criminal, but all behavior.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, we see this with all the time. So then there's this concept. So this is kind of hedonics. And the more that we operate from here, the more we're eudaimonic. This is my understanding of the neuroscience of it. And like one other way to look at this is that none of this stuff is actually existing. This is all unconscious processing. And the reason that we feel good when we operate this is because of eudaimonia. But anyway, so here's what we kind of...
If you know, hedonics is for hedonism, what is eudaimonia? What's the base of that?
We're going to talk about that. So hedonics is pleasure, gratification, the fulfillment of desires, comes from the nucleus accumbens and dopamine, but I'm going to show you a paper that shows that that's not even correct. A lot of what I'm saying is like oversimplifications, because the truth is that neuroscience is incredibly complicated.
Yeah, we're still figuring it out. So
okay, so now here's the cool thing. So here's what we know leads to eudaimonia. Okay. First is self-determinism. Second is self-expression. Third is effort. And fourth is importance. Right? So when I see your life, now we're talking science, okay? Forget about soul and all this nonsense.
Sure.
When I see your life, I see all four of these things. So you are living a a life of self-determinism. You decide you want to do something. Right, we'll talk about the transcendence. We're going to go to science, then we'll end up in spirituality.
I'm fine with that.
So there's self-determinism. There's self-expression, right? Very literally, like you are expressing yourself constantly. When we look at burnout, what we tend to find is that burnout is inversely correlated with eudaimonia. So in cases of burnout, like you were saying, people don't get recognized for their work. They don't get to do what they want in their job. And the advice that you give people is like, if you make your hobby your job, there's a chance you may not love it. And why is that? That's because when it's a hobby, it's all about self-expression and self-determination. But once you have invoices to send, once you have customer service tickets to handle, once you have all this kind of stuff, you lose that capacity for self-determination and self-expression.
Yeah, another big one that I talk to people about is if you're feeling bad in your job, like you don't feel good, you don't feel like what you're doing matters, is to talk to your boss. And if your boss is good in any capacity, they'll tell you you're doing great, here's how, or you're doing badly, here's how. And either way, you have an answer which helps state that goal. Like if it's bad, then you have a target. If it's good, then you have backup, right?
Yeah, so I don't think that works for most people. So I think your advice is correct.
I've seen it work sometimes, but I think you're right. I think in some, because it hinges on another person that is an outside unknown variable. And
no,
that boss,
so I mean, I would argue that the reason that works so well, so I think it's the right advice.
Sure.
I think if we want to understand when people do that, they're not able to hear that. Right? So I think that's what that's what you give them. I think it's very important that you do that, Thor. I don't think it's the wrong answer. I'm saying it doesn't work for some people. And the reason is because of the ego.
That I agree with.
Right,
No, I
because-
super agree with that. That's one of the biggest things is I don't think there is a silver bullet, if that makes sense.
There is.
Oh.
So
now you've got the secret
I think
sauce.
you
Now I
found
know.
it. Right? That's what we're talking about, the silver bullet. I don't, just
Sure.
because things are complex, we'll get there. But
Okay.
I just want to point out that if you go to your boss, and sure, that's assuming that your boss is decent, but even in the case that your boss is decent, if your boss says you're doing a bad job and here are the reasons why, for a lot of people,
They'll say, I suck. Yeah.
they'll go down this and they can't go down this. So what is
Yep.
the difference between, that's the ego.
It's framing and
Right?
ego. Yeah.
So I think part of what you offer, which is awesome, Thor, is that you teach people this literal thinking. And the more that people think this instead of this, if this is what happens in their mind, their ego will get weaker and they will proceed. You're 100% correct.
That's always why I try to frame it that way, which is when you get the answer, if the answer is negative, you need to see it as a target that you can reach to fix, to get better. And you have to see it that way. And if you don't see it that way, then it's worthless.
But in that track of thinking, Thor, I invite you, I mean, this is what I see. I see no ego there. Right? I see externalization of the issue.
Do you think it's beneficial to portray that as even an option, though? Because I find a lot of the times people don't even realize that's possible.
Yes, they don't.
Yeah.
No, I think what you're doing is, let me be super clear. I think what you're doing is correct, very beneficial, and you are training people, you are literally training people to think in this way. You're training people to think outside of the ego. Well, I think the main thing that I'm sort of pointing out is that the reason that you offer advice and it has a differential impact on people, and now what I'm trying to do is talk to the members of your audience, if they want your advice to apply better, translate more into their life, this is a missing component. Because it is the people who are not able to absolve themselves of their ego, not become objective, not think long term, not zoom out, they're not able to do those things, then it won't work. If they're able to do this, and we see in your life that you had an inflection point of dissolution of the ego, which is why you can think like this.
I do think that it's funny because I don't ever call that to attention for that, because I know that there are more components that went into that, and it's kind of like a journey of that over time.
Sure.
Because I find sometimes people will use that as a sort of a crutch for it to say, well, I can't do it because I didn't have that experience.
Ah, so interesting. Look at what were those statements that you made?
Well, I can't do it because I didn't have that experience specifically. And I do see that, where people are like, well, he had it, so he's got the special power now,
Yes. Look at
that's
that.
the thing. It's a way to defeat any potential type of growth by saying that you're in a position where it is impossible for you without trying.
Absolutely. So that statement comes from the ego. That's why it doesn't work. Do you see
Makes
that?
sense.
It's like the same construction.
Absolutely.
Any construction that operates from here is going to be like flawed. Maybe not any, but the majority of them in the context that we're talking about. Okay? So, I think that this is like, and this is what, I'm sort of lost myself for a second. Because I love it, because that's exactly what they say, right? And now we see like the principle in play is that a lot of people go through their lives. It's interesting because you mentioned adaptability. I just put together a lecture, which hopefully will be coming out soon. And one of the key things that makes people less adaptable is I'll skip that for now.
I think the big thing for me is you're not going to succeed in the same way as me. You're not going to succeed in the same way as somebody else. That's why I really dislike when people draw comparisons between themselves and other people's work. They're like, oh, I'm not a good artist because look at that artist over there. It doesn't make any sense. They're in a completely different journey, completely different things that they've learned. They've gone a totally different path for learning things. You have to look at yourself 3 months ago, 6 months ago, and say, where am I compared to where I was? And that to me is more important than looking at someone else's thing. It's like looking at someone else's progress. And that's the same thing for me, right? I did all my things. I went down that path and did all these things. But the idea is that you have your own path and you learn your own things in your own way. And you'll have your own adaptations that are vastly different from mine. And that's kind of how that goes, right?
Yeah. So I would agree 100% that the healthiest comparison to make in life is a comparison to yourself. And even that
that's a big one.
That can get messed up though, because like, especially when I work with people who are like sober, like you're sober for a year and then you relapse and then you look at your former self
and you see you've fallen. Yeah.
And you see that you've fallen and that can create problems. So even I think ego is like, basically it should never be in control. Like it's a tool, just like your logic and your emotion.
Yeah.
So,
I do think that is probably one of the most devastating situations I've seen, is when someone is relapsing, especially from addiction. You know, that's just it's so rough, because that does break that entire thing of like, look at everything that I've accomplished. I've made it this far, you know, but again, it's the I. I've made it.
It's the I. It's the I, it's the I, it's the I. Okay?
Yep.
So just one last, I mean, I'm not feeling too much of a need for science right here, but we'll just kind of talk about this very quickly. So if you look at like, this is the hedonic brain circuitry, right? So I think nucleus accumbens is going to be somewhere over here. Let's see. Yeah. So yeah, right here. It's whatever this one is. It's somewhere around here. And then what we know is that where's the eudaimonia? Anyway, eudaimonia comes from other parts of your brain, like your ventromedial prefrontal cortex. I don't see it over here. But it's like, anyway, so it comes, so we know that eudaimonia comes from some areas, pleasure comes from other areas. And that basically, like, even when it comes to, let me just look at, yeah, so in particular, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex forms these flourishing beliefs by generating positive evaluations of life circumstances like life satisfaction, the self-esteem, relationships, and goal progress. So eudaimonia is about these kinds of dimensions. Now, I know I'm talking about the ego, but I'm using ego. The reason I use ahamkar is because that's a different concept. It's actually a different thing. But the self is not ego. The ego is the construction of my identity. And what we sort of know is that the regions that are associated with hedonics and pleasure are different from the regions that are associated with like being satisfied with your life. We also know that, let me see if I can find this. It's not here. Okay. I was hoping to find a good paper. I think it's in a different paper that talks about what the components of eudaimonia are. I'm sure they'll have it here. Give me a second. Okay, we'll skip that. I don't think it's that important. But anyway, the point here is that when we're talking about living a fulfilling life, we don't want to operate from these things. And interestingly enough, accomplishment of goals, so this is really important. Goal accomplishment is over here. This is one that really trips people up. So if you look at eudaimonics, it's not accomplishment. It's actually effort and importance. It's things like self-determinism and self-expression. And if you look at studies on burnout, what we know, we basically know what burns people out. So what burns people out is not working hard. It is working hard and being ineffectual.
Yep.
So for me, like the top of the list is like, I can see a patient, I can be on call. I remember there's one particular case from residency where we had a patient who was on the, I was working on the neurology floor, so not psychiatry. And we had a patient who needed a very expensive, so we had a 40-year-old person who basically had an autoimmune condition where his eyes were being eaten by his immune system. So the eyes are super scary because they're actually immunoprotected. So our body knows what we are and it knows what other people are. This is why we get transplant rejection and things like that, because the body recognizes this is foreign tissue. One really scary thing is that our eyes are never exposed to our immune system. So if our immune system ever gets into our eyes in a certain way, it'll actually activate an autoimmune reaction and your immune system will eat your eyes. So this was happening to this patient in real time. And we had worked really hard to figure out why this person who was in their 40s like suddenly was going blind. We were like, what the hell is going on? So we did all kinds of tests and stuff. And then we finally figured out, okay, this is an autoimmune reaction. So we talked to the insurance company, and the insurance company was like, we're not going to pay for that treatment. We're like, this is crazy. Like, you guys need to pay for it. So that's the height of burnout. Like the whole 24 hours of very, very intensive tests and calling consultants and like talking to this person and really trying to figure it out.
Insurance doesn't care. Yeah.
That we're fine with. Like that doesn't burn you out. Working hard doesn't burn you out. It is the inability to work hard. It is working hard and not getting some kind of result that really leads to burnout.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. I mean, like since I work in, rescue, we get all kinds of cases that come in, and some of them are pretty horrific. Like 2 of the ferrets that we had have an autoimmune disorder called DIM, disseminated idiopathic myofasciitis. And it's the neutrophils, which is a component of the immune system, attacking all of the soft tissue of their body. Heart, everything. And they basically just form holes everywhere and disintegrate. That's kind of how that goes. And it's horrific to watch, but I gained a lot of good feeling out of this from like helping them, because what we did was we reached out to the foremost veterinarian in Oregon that is dealing with this. We took that and then worked with them, and they gave us all their research, and then we worked with the ferrets to try and figure this out. And basically what we did was we gave them a chemotherapy that suppresses the bone marrow, that reduces the neutrophils in the body, and ferrets regenerate very quickly, right? So at a certain point, if you keep doing this, and you do it in ways where it doesn't kill them, because the bone marrow also produces red blood cells, so you don't want them to, run out of that. But thankfully, ferrets don't have blood types, so you can just do transfusions if that does happen, which is kind of cool. They get to a point where they regenerate faster than the damage being done. So now Mocha and Latte, the 2 that we have like this, they're totally fine. They're in remission because of it. And those types of situations are like really scary. Autoimmune situations are insane to deal with. So you just watch them deteriorate.
I'm kind of curious about that. Can I ask a couple questions? Sure. You may not know so when you say they regenerate, fair enough from like a red blood cell perspective, but as soon as the bone marrow bounces back, don't the neutrophils start attacking the muscle tissue again?
Yes, they do. So what we have to do is just keep doing testing again to see what their neutrophil count is. Generally, a ferret that's in DIM, it is a detection of exclusion, right? So they test for exclusion, they test everything else first, and then they find at the end, this is the only thing that is left, so it's usually pretty hard. Most people euthanize a ferret that has DIM, most of the time. There's been an uptick in it recently. They don't quite know the cause. There's not enough research that's being done on this, but situations like this allow us to learn more stuff, and they spread it out to all the vets that we work with and everything like that. But with this one, it was it's more interesting because when you're testing for this, you can see the neutrophil count is very high, insanely high. Normally, a ferret's going to have usually between 500 and 2,000 per blood count, and they're at like 160,000. Like crazy high numbers. We're like, this is ridiculous.
What do your ferrets eat?
Raw food diets. So everything is fully raw food diets. It's a freeze-dried raw food, and it's easy to control that because it's easy to figure out what their kidney and liver values are supposed to be out of that while making sure they get all the proper nutrition. I'm curious though, like when you say, fine, it's freeze-dried raw food, but what is it? Meat, 100% meat. They're obligate carnivores. Sorry. Meat and bone.
Huh?
It is all meat and bone. They are obligate carnivores, so meat, bone, and egg is all they can eat.
Interesting. So ferrets don't eat any vegetables?
No, not at all. It'll actually kill them. So if you give them even pea protein, so like protein derived from peas, it gives them kidney stones. Can't have anything other than meat. Meat, bone, and egg. Yep. No such thing as a vegan ferret. Not a thing.
What percentage of their diet is egg?
Oh, very low, to be honest with you. It depends. Some ferrets can have indigestion from that. Very low amounts of it can cause kind of like, well, the poops, right? They'll have diarrhea from it if they don't tolerate it very well. But it's usually seen as more of a treat. A lot of it is mostly ground meat and bone. And the biggest thing you have to target is taurine, because you have to make sure they get about 500 milligrams of taurine per day for a healthy kind of ferret. And they do self-regulate, so they won't overeat, which is interesting. Not like a dog. We'll just keep eating and eating and eating. Mm-hmm. But so you can just kind of put food in there and they'll self-regulate. But if you don't do that, you don't hit that mark, they get heart disease, and it will kill them 100% of the time. We've actually reversed some of the heart disease in ours for that.
What do wild ferrets eat?
Black-footed ferrets are the same. Yeah.
No, but like what is their actual prey?
Oh, geez, all kinds of stuff. So a ferret can actually take down an animal between 2 to 3 times its size. They can take down a chicken. They can take down other small mammals. They can take down. There's they're very vicious hunters, but their primary diet, the primary thing they want to take down, rabbits. They are very skilled at going into burrows and taking down rabbits. No problem.
Interesting.
That's a big thing that they're fantastic at it. They're
So
actually used for hunting in Europe because of that.
do they eat reptiles, amphibians, or insects?
No, not insectivores. I think in a pinch they might try to eat a reptile, but that's not like a normal thing. And amphibians also not like a normal thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so I was just curious because a lot of with this autoimmune stuff, at least what we know for humans, is that dietary changes have huge impacts on autoimmune status.
We're seeing, as odd as this is, the last time that we had a huge uptick in specifically DIM was when they changed the formulation for what is called canine distemper vaccine. So canine distemper is a 100% chance of death in ferrets. It is vicious. They don't survive whatsoever, and it spreads throughout the population very quickly because it's a fecal oral route, and it just goes through the whole thing, kills them all. So what they have to do is every ferret gets canine distemper vaccine, and something with Marshall's, they changed the formulation on it, and they had a massive increase in DIM, and then they changed the formulation again, and it dropped off again. There are still cases where they get DIM, but we don't know why quite yet. There's not enough research, and unfortunately, because so few veterinarians are actually trained on how to identify DIM in the first place, we don't get a lot of good data points on how to detect this, and we don't get a lot of good data points on how widespread it really is. Most of the time, it's ferret is lethargic, they're having these weird problems, they're not eating, they're not drinking, euthanize, and that's it is very sad, but that's generally the way that it goes. So when we talk to other vets or rescues or anything like that, if we find out that they have a ferret that fits the kind of general conditions that a DIM ferret could have, we go talk to your vet, here's some paperwork, and take this. And we've had a couple of times where they're like, oh yeah, no, totally. Like this, it turns out that they do have DIM, but the chemotherapy for that is also incredibly expensive. It's like $450 a treatment, and you're talking like a treatment every 2 weeks for the next 6 months, right? And like that's not cheap for people. It's not cheap at all. So like there's got to be something that changes with that to save these animals really when they're in this kind of a situation. Thankfully, with us running the rescue here on Twitch and like the ad revenue from that, ad revenue paid for it all. So we just do it and we don't have to think about it and save the animals' lives. But for an average owner, that's not possible, which is why euthanasia happens. We usually will reach out to people that we can find out for that. And if they are in an area where we can take them, we try to be like, hey, do you want to surrender the animal? Because we have a good chance of saving them. We have a good track record with this. We haven't lost one yet so far because we know how to handle it. But that's a big part of building that new rescue is like, the point of this is going to be the largest rescue in the United States. That's the whole idea, is to make sure that we can have kind of a coverage that's beyond just 50-mile radius, which is sort of where we're at right now. It's like the 50 miles is about it. It's like 50 to 100 miles is like the maximum that we can really go, because outside of that, it's not possible. It's just too far. And
what is the average lifespan of a ferret?
In the United States, it's about 5 years due to poor genetics, unfortunately. Marshall's Farms is the primary breeder inside of the U.S. They produce all the laboratory animals for the United States, federally funded, so that's not really going anywhere. Unfortunately, the breeding practices have led to bad genetics that include heart disease and cancer. Incredibly common. In Europe, most ferrets live to about 10, and they've also found that if you take a European ferret and you crossbreed them with a polecat, they live to almost 20 years old, or 1 year old, because they either die horrifically to cancer really early, or they live forever, which is really interesting and kind of strange.
Polecat is a kind of ferret?
Polecat is another mustelid, so wild type, different sort of animal, kind of like a mink or things like that, right? Okay. So mustelids, the whole classification of mustelids can be like badgers, I think otters, all kinds of different stuff. It's mustelid.
Those animals that look very friendly but will fucking tear you apart.
Rip you to bits. Yeah. Oh yeah. They're so vicious. If the ferrets were larger, I'd be dead. Right?
Is an otter a mustelid?
I'm pretty sure an otter is. Let me look this up. I want to make sure before I move forward.
Yeah, so I think it just falls under the category of like cute and I want to cuddle it, but it can literally eviscerate me.
Yeah, they have such strong bite strength, as well, and they're they're a little weasel shaped. They're so cute.
Yeah, they're vicious. Absolutely.
And some ferrets will bite you pretty hard too. You got to train it out of them. That's a pretty common thing. Behavioral training.
Thor, I know this is a little bit outside of the scope of my expertise in this conversation, but I think that especially with myofasciitis, I've seen a lot of really good outcomes. I don't know how many studies there are on this. I imagine they're out there. I'm just, rheumatology and autoimmune disease is not my area of expertise, but I see it a lot. I used to see it a lot in my patients because there's an overlap between autoimmune illness and a lot of these like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome. There's a lot of these things that end up in psychiatry, or like oftentimes these weird occult autoimmune kind of, what's another example? Chronic Lyme is like another good example of like some weird autoimmune activation. And diet really seems to be like quite helpful for a fair chunk of patients.
Yeah.
So
that's the hardest part about this is there's no way you can possibly modify the diet. We can choose a different protein source, but it has to be animal-based protein, because if you go into vegetable-based protein, they get kidney stones, and they get them real fast too. So you end up having this weird problem with that, where like there's not a huge amount of options, unfortunately. And I'd love to explore that more. I really would. I just don't know where to go for that.
Yeah, the next time I'll. This is kind of floating around in the back of my mind. I may just, the next time I get in touch with a few colleagues, I may just ask them if they know anything about ferrets. But
oh yeah, no, totally. And it's funny because like my main goal with it is we create enough situations where there is a positive outcome, like we have, like where they're basically in remission, right? And to be real with you, the way that we see remission on this is Mocha and Latte have not had a treatment for 6 months, and they've had no problems. They run around, they play like any other ferrets, they have no issues, right? None. It's wild. And my hope is to get rid of that idiopathic part of that diagnosis, right? Which is if you don't know what idiopathic means, it's we don't know where it comes from, and like that's it, right? We just don't know. We have no idea. We're like, this happens spontaneously from somewhere, and it sucks. It's a really awful thing. We don't know the cause. And eventually, my hope is that we do know the cause. And there's just not enough information. I think a lot of that information gets lost because we euthanize the animals when we don't know what it is. Oh, yeah. You didn't hear about Henry, did you? Our ferret.
No.
So we had a ferret come in. He had been owned by these people since he was half a year old. If a ferret mom gets, and you're going to love this. This is wild. If a ferret mom gets feline parvo or canine distemper, whether she lives or dies, the babies that she has have a very high chance of having weird brain anomalies, physical changes in the brain, and usually they end up dead, right? So this ferret comes into us, and he's 2 years old, and the owners are like, he's only turning left, or like, oh, that's neurologic. Like immediately, you're like, that's going to be a neurologic issue. He can only do circling behavior, only moving left. Like something's definitely wrong here. He can't control his mouth. He can't eat. So we're syringe feeding him for like weeks, and we go and get him a CT scan. We found out he has middle ear infections and outer ear infections in both ears. So we're like, okay, here's something we can objectively find out what's going on here, and see how he reacts afterwards. Afterwards, he stopped what is called head pressing, where they push their head on things because they're in so much pain. And he stopped the inability to eat. It fell away, so he could feed himself. But he moved really weird. He's constantly doing these weird head movements, and he's still not running quite correctly. There's clearly something wrong. So we set up an MRI, and MRIs are pretty expensive, but like, again, rescue pays for it. We can do the whole thing. And we put him through the whole MRI. We get him out. 60% of his brain is scar tissue. 60%, and it's all through the brain. Like it's 60% of the white matter of the brain is scar tissue. And even the portions that would normally control autonomic functions, so like things like heart and lungs, totally scar tissue, which is mind-boggling. So the time that he was born was when there was whistleblowers that talked about there being a canine distemper outbreak at Marshall's, where they suddenly stopped giving ferrets to any of the vet or any of the Petcos inside of the United States. And so whistleblowers said that about 250,000 ferrets died. That time period was when he was born, which means there's a very high chance his mom got canine distemper, if that was true. He somehow survived 6 months with that kind of issue, moving like that without being detected, because they would call him if that was the case, if they found him. Made it into a pet store, got bought at half a year, made it to 2 years this way, and then came to us. And then finally we find out what's wrong with him. And it's wild because we've been able to see him adopt behaviors from the other ferrets. So he can do things like digging behavior now. Didn't do that when he first came to us. He can run and jump now. He tried to groom one of the other ferrets the other day, which is new behavior. And like we can watch him being able to pick up social traits, but it's mind-boggling to see how much of his brain is damaged. It's completely. I can actually send you the.
You said white matter damage, right?
That is correct, 60%. And some other portions, some other structures for that it's completely annihilated, basically.
So
And it is fully symmetrical, the damage. So it had to have happened before he was born.
Is canine distemper a parvovirus?
Let me actually look that up to make sure.
Because you
sure
mentioned parvo earlier, and I was
feline parvo.
So, it's interesting because I mean that's consistent. So it's fascinating. I love hearing that story. So here's like a couple of initial thoughts. First is you mentioned that
yes, parvovirus. Yes, both of them are.
So you mentioned that the ferret wasn't culled, right? So like we have to think about it kind of statistically. So it actually makes sense. Like everything in your story makes sense, and things could get better. So let's understand a couple of basics. One is so when you have, a perinatal or prenatal viral infection of the brain, generally speaking, that is very, very bad. But it sort of makes sense. It's almost like a selection bias where the ferret how can I say this? Out of 250,000 ferrets, if there is one ferret that happens to have the viral infection in a certain way that it is not detected early, like it kind of dodged the bullet. Does that make sense? Because if it had affected maybe the gray matter part of the brain, which we'll talk about in a second, then you're kind of like SOL, and then it would have been detected. So the fact that it did not get detected means that that's a good prognostic sign.
Oh, but I think it was negligence that it wasn't detected.
Okay, fair enough.
He moved very strangely.
So that's absolutely a possibility. But my point is that, like, sure, it could be negligence, but the other thing is that the particular damage of this perinatal infection was on the less severe side, which is why the ferret did not get culled.
Oh, yeah.
Second,
I think that it made me wonder if it was just the chaos of what was going on in there, legitimately.
Sure.
Because when he's around any other ferret, it's very obvious.
So there's all kinds of other things that could go into that, but just from just purely a medical perspective, forget about the circumstances, forget about things like that. Oh, yeah. So because we see this sometimes where there's someone who has a really messed up brain. And then, but the whole thing is that even though the brain is super messed up, something about the pattern of damage is, it's kind of like, if I get shot by a gunshot wound does not have the same effect depending on where it hits my body. So even though
I sent you a video just so you can see, so you can have the context.
Hold on.
Because I totally understand where you're coming from, but this is profound.
So I don't know how to look at a ferret brain, but I definitely see.
So I can walk you through the ferret brain, but the video, if you see him,
oh yeah,
unable
you can tell
to really
that
control
this is.
himself.
But I mean, how do I show this?
Oh, yeah.
Hold on, I gotta.
Like he does not move normally whatsoever.
Hold on a second.
And this is every action that he makes, and he's constantly, shaking. This is the first time he ever tried to groom another ferret, by the way, that video that you just saw. So the one that's white there, that's Mouse.
Yeah.
Mouse has what is called Waardenburg syndrome, if you've heard of that.
Wallenberg or Wardenberg?
Waardenburg.
I've heard of Wallenberg.
No, it's very different.
Yeah, so that's...
But you can see Henry's, that head movement, that's the biggest thing, is he does that all the time, constantly. It's very, very obviously neurologic condition.
Yeah, I mean,
so that's why it's so surprising.
Is this the cerebellum? Do you know what part of the white matter this is?
So if you want to look at this, I've sent you a tweet there as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to pull it. But do you know if that's the cerebellum? Because
part of it was cerebellar damage.
So this looks like cerebellar damage.
We thought it was going to be cerebellar hypoplasia first. Yep. That was what we believed going into it.
Makes sense.
And it turned out to be this instead, on top of some kind of lesions on the cerebellum, which we need to fully review it with radiologists soon.
Yeah.
But if you see, do you see the white on the top of the brain there?
Yeah. Hold
That's
on,
all lesion.
Let me just pull this up so that people can see.
Sure. Yeah. The official diagnosis from the veterinary was Swiss cheese brain. They were like, I've never seen anything like this.
So this is where the cerebellum. I don't know what a ferret brain looks like, but this is generally the ballpark of the cerebellum. Not this stuff over here, but this looks quite cerebellar. And the main thing is that this kind of ataxia looks cerebellar. Like the way that the way I describe it is that. So the ferret is trying to target something, but the part of our brain that
manages that.
Yeah, like that the part of our brain that's like, if I want to like point over here, like my cerebellum is what lets me do that. So it's basically like missing. Like when you have cerebellar damage, it's like you have an accuracy debuff where you can't like hit things where you want them to go. And
he also has like he's also got like cognitive issues where like he can choose a thing and he does the thing. And most other ferrets will do like multitasking. They'll try to do different things. They'll try to like, they have like kind of a forethought for that. He does not. There's definitely other factors in there.
So the really interesting thing, so you're saying that he's getting better, right? So here's the cool thing. So our brain has white matter and has gray matter. Gray matter is, generally speaking, neuronal tissue. So these are neurons, and generally speaking, we don't regenerate neurons. But our white matter is things like astrocytes. These are the supportive cells of the brain. And the good news, I mean, if it's scarring, that's a different issue. But generally speaking, white matter we can recover.
Yeah,
So,
it's full lesions, unfortunately. So I don't know if it will recover, but seeing him perform new behaviors is incredibly compelling.
So that's why there's like, I think it's consistent, right? So if this is like a white matter lesion, like it's white matter doesn't, and if there's scars, that's a whole different ballgame, because scars are like, we can recover white matter if there isn't stuff in the way, but scars are like rubble that prevent the white matter from regrowing.
Bingo.
I'm not a neurologist,
basically
but
there's going to be like a little bit of scarring in there and then a little bit that can be recovered. And I'm wondering if we're basically seeing the recovery of those pieces that can be over time, because he's clearly forming new bonds, new behaviors. Like that's not what I expected. I expected him to say the same.
I mean, I wouldn't expect this cerebellar damage to get completely back to normal, but there's two different mechanisms going on. One is that white matter can heal. That's what we see in like multiple sclerosis, for example. So that's like a white matter, get these white matter lesions, and then when someone goes into remission from MS, like they recover, hopefully. Second thing is the brain can still adapt, right? So even in the case of like gray matter problems, when someone has a stroke, the brain will adapt, and then you'll have like some part of the brain that takes over and does the lifting for something that a different part of the brain used to do.
Makes sense. Yeah, so, no, that's exactly what I thought, because especially with the autonomic function area that had been damaged, because we talked to, I forget the portion of the brain that was handling that one that was confirmed damage, but basically it looks like it shifted somewhere else. And they're just like, don't know where, something else is handling it. It's just like, okay.
Yeah, that's what the brain does. So
he's clearly still got a heartbeat, like that's kind of how it came down to.
The coolest example of, I mean, I don't know if this is cool, but I had a, I can't remember the exact, I think, so I had a patient who had an amputation below the knee. And something, I think I don't remember the exact circumstances of the problem, but they had an amputation below the knee, and then the part of their brain that was devoted to that. So basically we have a map in our brain of our like physical body. And so you have certain regions of the brain that will correlate with your face and your feet and things like that. So this patient, when they had the below the knee amputation, so there's basically a part of their body missing. Sometimes this results in things like phantom limb, where like you can feel the part of your body even though it's not there anymore. But this person, they actually, this part of their knee mapped onto the part of their brain that was devoted to the clitoris mapped onto their knee. And so what started happening is they could achieve orgasm by someone rubbing their stump. And it's amazing. Yep. Like cool it's brain. Crazy, like what the brain is capable of. And a lot of people are like,
wild thing.
A lot of people are like, like that sounds epic, but it's actually can be quite debilitating, because when you look at a prosthetic, like, it's like
how do you walk?
Yeah, it's very challenging. So it was a very, very difficult case, but it's super interesting. Yeah, like you can get all kinds of weird. Your brain gets confused.
It's wild. But yeah, it's kind of funny because I didn't even mean to derail it all, but I just wanted to show you that because I thought you'd be really interested. It's bonkers. And we just found out this last week too. It's only been like a week since we found out about it, and it's like no one expected that. Everyone expected like, oh, it's probably going to be cerebellar hypoplasia. That's what we thought originally, because cats get that too. When the mama cat gets feline parvo. Very common, and they call them wobble cats online. It's usually what you see. And ferrets get the exact same outcome. So you're like, maybe it's that. It's like, no, this is way more wild than that.
Looks very cerebellar.
Yeah.
Anyway, going back to I love the detour. Like, this is cool. Like, it's like I haven't looked at an MRI in like a year. I mean, the last one I looked at was like a human MRI, but I don't get a whole lot of opportunities to look at MRIs, so it's nice to be able to, dust off the cobwebs a little bit.
I can send you some really wild ones for this too, like just massive, like all the files. I think you'll really dig them. And it's funny because you see the exact same types of behavior in humans, depending on the portion of the brain that's damaged.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I'm not a vet, right? But that looks like cerebellar problems, and that's the region of the brain, and so it makes sense.
I know more about animal medicine, specifically with ferrets, than I do with humans.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot that carries over, right? Like, so we tend to have, you mentioned inner ear stuff. I was getting hopeful there that it was like an inner ear infection that's messing with your vestibular system, so that's why the ferret is always turning left. Yeah.
I was like, oh, it's vestibular. Sense. Yeah, and it's not.
Because then if you deal with the infection, it can start turning right again.
Yeah, but, and they usually recover, at least in ferrets, they usually recover really fast when it's vestibular.
Yeah, I mean, but still, turning left is like, that's not consistent with vestibular. Usually that sounds more like hemi-neglect, which does sound more neurologic. And I don't know if y'all have seen like, pictures of hemi-neglect and clocks, but this is neuroscience. I mean, neurology is just fascinating.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to watch.
So this is a great example of what hemi-neglect looks like. So it's like your brain can't see. I don't know if I'm screen sharing this with you, but your brain can't. You'll basically make a whole clock face on like half of it. So this is what hemi-neglect looks like. So sometimes if we're all left, like if we can't turn right, that's because our brain can't see. So this is what hemi-neglect. If you ask someone about what they see, like they won't be able to see half of the stuff. Yeah. And if you ask them to draw a clock, their brain only recognizes like one half of the thing.
I think there was a thing like this. There was a case where a guy had the two halves of his brain were severed. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And he was able to like identify objects differently based on which eye it was being seen in. I have to look into that study again. It was wild.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it if you want. It's
yeah, no, absolutely.
It's so basically what happens is our eyes are like contralateral. So my right eye actually see like the left part of the brain. Well, it gets complicated depending on what the tracts look like, but so like basically half of the visual field is anyway. So eyes can be somewhat contralateral, and the really interesting thing is that different parts of the brain have access to different qualities of information. So when you get a severing of the corpus callosum, there are certain
and that's the bond between the two halves of the brain. It's the big highway.
There are certain things, I mean, my neurology is rusty, but there are certain things that the left eye, which is connected to the right side of the brain, will be able to perceive for example, the emotional impact of an object that you perceive. I could be wrong on the details there. This is like, I'd have to sit down and draw out the tracts and stuff, but so like basically like if you ask someone who has like this cerebellar severing and you ask them to close their right eye and they look at something with their left eye, they'll be able to tell like, oh, this is like someone's like favorite stuffed animal. They'll know that part. But if you ask them how many ears does this bunny have, they may not be able to tell you. Yeah. And on the right side, through the right eye, which is connected to the left hemisphere of the brain, they'll have the opposite. So they'll be like, if I ask you like, okay, like what is this? They may not be able to name it, but they'll be able to tell you like, oh, it has like this many eyes and this many ears. It's that hoppy, animal. But they like, so it's all kinds of weird shit goes on in the brain with hemi-neglect, and I'm rusty on that stuff, but it's super cool.
You basically have two types of brain fighting each other.
Yeah, so
to figure out what it is that they're looking at collectively.
We just, I think we're about to release our trauma guide, and what's really fascinating about this is dissociation is basically a signaling version of that. So there's an anatomical severing, but what we know in people who dissociate is that they have, like, they're experiencing something. So it's something called hemispheric lateralization, where they're going through a really terrible experience, but they feel no emotion. And that's literally because what happens in their brain, the emotion is so overwhelming that it's almost like, the blast doors on like these like spaceships when you get hit by a torpedo and then you're like venting vacuum in these sci-fi things and you like close the blast door. Like that's what the brain does. So our brain is like, there's way too much emotional fire over here. We need to protect our logical side of the brain. So they shut the blast doors and they separate out like these two parts. The problem is that part of the brain is still active. We become numb to it. And so then it starts doing things like resulting in impulsive behavior and leads to things like addictions and like all kinds of other problems. So it doesn't shut off. It's just we segregate the two halves of our brain as like a survival mechanism. And the subjective experience of that is dissociation. So
would you say that the two halves are adversarial, but in a positive way, in a normal general way, like normal general function? Because it seems like it's like an adversarial model where it learns from it's this, no, it's this, no, it's this, but it's actually this together, and then they can agree.
I wouldn't say it's adversarial. Like, so I don't think basically so things are balanced. Mm-hmm. Right. But like, I don't think any part of the body or brain is adversarial all of them have the same goal. Right. So we all evolved to have like survival. So there can be conflict. Right. And that can happen even between like, for example, like our heart and our kidneys and our lungs and our kidneys and our heart and our lungs. There's all kinds of homeostatic mechanisms to where if one part of the body is not doing what it's supposed to, the other part of the body will compensate. So I'd say it's co-op. It's like PvE. It's not like PvP.
Makes sense. Yeah, no, see, a lot of the times we build things like that in kind of like programming, adversarial model, which is like you have one side that works one way, one side that works another way, and it's competition between the two to make the whole thing more efficient and find a better sort of description for what it's seeing, if that makes sense. So that's why I was wondering if it worked the same, if it was similar in any way in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use the word adversarial, but there are absolutely like balancing mechanisms, and there are different parts of the brain that will, in a sense, compete with each other. So a really good example of this is the thalamus. So the thalamus is sort of our sensory processing center for the brain. So what happens is like we constantly have input from our eyes, ears, nose, and then like what gets floated to your attention. So the thalamus integrates, but I don't think that the eyes and the ear, well, I mean, in some cases you could argue that they're competing, but not really. Right. So, there's, but things.
It's like a friendly.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, the thalamus
is trying. No, it's this.
Yes. So all parts of the body and all of our sensory organs are inputting things into the thalamus. And then the thalamus is basically deciding for us, like what floats to the top. Yeah. But I don't think that our eyes are like competing against our ears. Like the signals need to be balanced, but I don't think it's like a competition where one wins and one loses.
Makes sense.
In fact, when you have that, that's when you end up with illness. So there are cases where if we look at things like chronic pain. So chronic pain is when there is a part of our brain that is amplifying its signal and ignores everybody else. So when it goes PvP, we end up in chronic pain where it's demanding your attention constantly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Would you say, are there any similarities between that and restless leg syndrome? As interesting as that is.
My first answer is not really. My second answer is that I am almost sure that my first answer is wrong. So
I was reading some interesting studies about it, actually. So if you don't have anything, then do you?
What do you mean?
Oh no, I'm interested in here. Anyway, continue.
So here's what I would say. So like we have an understanding of the pathophysiology of restless leg. Okay. So it's like restless leg is somewhat idiopathic. At the same time, I'm sure that pathophysiology is incorrect. So the right answer, so we know that restless leg has a lot to do with the dopaminergic transmission. And so we'll use medications like ropinirole and other kinds of like dopaminergic agents because that seems to fix the problem. Mm-hmm. But there's no doubt in my mind that that is an incomplete understanding, and I have not kept up to date. I mean, the last time I got fresh on restless leg was like literally probably 9 years ago. So the last time I really treated a patient who had bad restless leg was like, I can think of the patient, it was like 9 years ago. Why do you ask about the research around restless leg? We can try to figure it out.
So something that was really interesting to me was like you said, dopaminergic. The interesting thing was like levels of dopamine that were actually being uptaken and being utilized, and restless leg syndrome. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was Shay used to have restless leg syndrome all the time. He used to complain about it constantly.
Who?
And Shay. So Shay runs the Ferret rescue with me.
Okay.
Makes art with me, does all this kind of stuff. And something that they found that was really interesting, because they were looking into literature for this, was they found that melatonin at one point had been correlated with reduced dopamine uptake. They stopped taking melatonin, they stopped having restless leg syndrome, which was really interesting. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that kind of subject.
So I mean, I can look some stuff up right now. I think that is consistent. So not that I know this stuff, but here's the mechanism of action that I would think. So melatonin helps us sleep. Generally speaking, dopamine is an activating neurotransmitter. So dopamine does all kinds of stuff, right? So it also does like saccadic movement, and it's implicated in Parkinson's and movement disorders and stuff. So, but if we like look at it like on a very, very high level, like abstract, not entirely scientific, but just clinical understanding. So if we have dopamine that's too high, we will become psychotic. So we'll like perceive things, like we'll hallucinate, we'll become angry, we'll feel attacked. So so we use antipsychotic medication is dopaminergic blockade.
Mm-hmm.
So if you kind of think about it, like dopamine in that way is like an activating neurotransmitter, and it doesn't surprise. I did not know this, but it does not surprise me at all that melatonin or other things that are correlated with the induction of sleep will slow down the activity of our dopamine.
Yeah, I sent you a PubMed there. Check it out.
So what I would venture is that melatonin, it makes sense that melatonin does. Oh, whoops. Hold on.
Melatonin.
Sorry. I left the call. By accident. I clicked the wrong thing. Hold on. Oh, God.
I've been deleted.
GG'd. Hold on. This should work. Discord. Let's go to this, and then let's go to this, and let's get you back. Well, you're back. Okay. You sent me a PubMed. Let's take a look.
I can't believe Dr. K works for Big Melatonin. Tried to get rid of me.
So before I take a look at this, I think this is the the way that I would understand it is dopamine is generally speaking activating. So it makes sense that melatonin production would suppress dopamine signaling.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. And then, we use dopaminergic agents to help with
sleep.
We use dopaminergic agents to help with restless leg. We don't use dopaminergic agents to put people to sleep.
Yeah, no, I mean, sorry, we use melatonin as a sleep aid.
Right.
But I found it to be kind of interesting, because I'm wondering, with things like that, it's always really interesting because it's seen as like super safe, right? It's seen as like the safest sleep aid you can have. And then we started finding these articles, and that's quite interesting.
Dude, this is literally exactly what I was hypothesizing.
That's exactly why I sent it to you.
Right.
So like, look at this.
This would make sense. So in Parkinson's patients, melatonin may, on the one hand, exacerbate symptoms. So this makes sense. So Parkinson's is a dopamine deficiency. Melatonin and dopamine are inversely correlated, right? Because when we want to go to sleep, we want to lower our dopamine levels. So this makes sense. Melatonin. Oh, this is interesting. So melatonin being an effective treatment for tardive dyskinesia is very interesting, because tardive dyskinesia is caused by prolonged dopaminergic blockade. Mm-hmm. So, and that's not that surprising. So that's kind of why I say, like, if you really look at it, like, unfortunately, the body is not, it's not like 1-to-1. There's all kinds of various compensatory mechanisms. So I would predict the melatonin being problematic for Parkinson's, but there's something weird going on with tardive dyskinesia. But then there's also reasons why that could make sense too, because tardive dyskinesia is actually an adaptation to prolonged dopaminergic stuff. And I mean, we can really get into that if you want to, but
it's like
that's a little
drugs
bit,
is what it looks like.
Yeah. So tardive dyskinesia is caused by the lifetime exposure to dopaminergic blockade.
Makes sense.
And so then what happens is tardive dyskinesia may in and of itself be a adaptation to chronic dopamine blockade. And so then actually here's the mechanism. So if my brain is, so this is probably it. I mean, we don't know, but
Yeah.
so tardive dyskinesia is my brain's adaptation to a lack of dopamine. So I don't need the adaptation if I no longer have a block of dopamine. Or if something else is blocking the dopamine for me, I no longer need to adapt. That's actually the mechanism. So tardive dyskinesia happens when we have dopamine blockade, and if melatonin comes in, then our brain is like, we don't need the tardive dyskinesia anymore because the melatonin is doing the job for us. I don't know if anyone in chat is following this, but like that would be my hypothesized mechanism. Who the fuck knows if that's actually what it is? But it's almost like the melatonin is doing the job of the tardive dyskinesia, and anytime our body gets something that does the job for us, it shuts down those mechanisms.
Yeah,
And
see,
if
this
I'm
is
right
exactly
on
why I
that,
brought this.
that would be I would think I'm a Chad. That would be like a Dr. K Chad moment.
That's exactly why I brought this to you, because like there are things that I get to see in animal medicine that I get to research all the time, things that I get to see in anecdotal evidence, and being able to pass it by somebody who knows this much better than me is way helpful, because I'm like, look at this. Does this make sense? You know, and I do that all the time for veterinary medicine when we're trying to come up with a way to handle that. You know, like trying to handle anything that's going on with the ferrets. Super common.
This is super cool paper though.
Yeah,
This
it is.
very, very interesting. It turns out that
I keep a list of these.
I could be wrong though, because they say that there's something about the antioxidant nature of melatonin. So I didn't even think about. I missed that one. That was anyway.
Yeah, this is super interesting though. But yeah, no, thanks for talking about that.
Yeah, no, I love talking about. I mean, I like medicine. Medicine's great, a lot of fun. Just circling back, so I feel like there was one other thing that I wanted to share with you. I know we're kind of off track.
That's fine.
But just to kind of TLDR for people. So earlier we were talking about like drive and burnout. And we were also talking about this kind of like this third space where your drives come from. So a couple of things, Thuriya, self, Atman, whatever. So I think that like the part of the reason that this stuff is easily accessible for you. So one of the explanation from the Eastern system, I'm not saying this is correct, but the way that they would explain that is that you've done some amount of spiritual practice in a past life. That being said, we don't know if that's real or not. There's also some really interesting biological mechanisms of that, which have to do with like epigenetic memory and things like that, that like we can basically inherit memories from our ancestors. So the concept of memory or learnings that come from beyond your life, that's scientifically fact. Instinct is a really great example of that. Like that's like learning that comes from before you were born. So there are sources of transmission of information and competence that can happen before you were born.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. But
I always found that to be interesting too, because it's like you can't just have an animal always act, you know, similar to the other animals like itself, even in isolation where they've never had any type of environmental factors where they've learned from others of their kind and they're still acting, you know, in the same way. It's always quite interesting.
You can't have so are you saying that some animals?
So like, as funny as this, say you take a ferret, you never show it to another ferret, they're still going to do war dances. They're still going to do all their behaviors, their digging behaviors, all those types of things, an instinctual drive to do those. And yeah,
outside of
the idea
socialization.
Where does that come from? Didn't come from socialization. They didn't learn it from humans. There has to be something that carries over.
Yeah. So that's a pretty well-known scientific fact.
Yep.
So the couple of things that you know I want people to kind of like take away is first is that I think if we look at your thought process, we see that there are very few egotistical oriented statements. We also see that the inflection point that you describe is actually very consistent with this idea of abandonment of the ego. Now, I think inflection point is a really good word because the other really important thing to understand is that the more that you think in an egotistical way, literally the number of thoughts that you have that are ego related will strengthen your ego. And the less you think in an egotistical, I am bad, I am good, I am a badass, I am grandiose, I am this, I am that, the fewer thoughts you have like that, the less egotistical you will become. So we know that, like, literally, if you take like 1,000 thoughts that you have, the percentage of them that are ego oriented with an I involved will correlate with like a stronger ego in a bad way. And that's just because your neurons will habituate. So like you will have patterns of thinking, which
training yourself.
Absolutely. And if you notice this, if you like know people who are like very habitual thinkers, like you can trigger people who will, go on their tirade. Like, I have family members that will go on their tirade about like, so I have a family member who thinks that the younger generation is losing touch with whatever the hell. And so that, like, all you have to do is like it's like you activate like boomerrant.exe. And then like what you'll notice is that what they say is like, it's like, it can be scripted, literally. They can repeat it over and over and over again. And it's not that it's right or wrong. It's just that once the script activates, it'll continue to activate.
It's never going to stop. Yeah.
And the script of the ego is something you have to be very careful about. And so literally, I think the really cool thing that you're doing, which I think correlates a lot with the success of your community, Thor, is that you are training people to think in a non-egotistical way. Right? Setbacks are setbacks. They're opportunities to learn. There's some stuff about growth mindset and Carol Dweck's work in there. The last thing that I want to talk to you about is, so a lot of people may be wondering, okay, how do I get rid of ego? How do I get access to that third space? So a couple of weird things about that third space. The first is that some people believe that all knowledge comes from there. I happen to be one of those people. So it's kind of weird, but like, because we notice that the conclusion happens first and then the logic and emotion happens afterward. There's this kind of belief that all knowledge exists in that third space that you have access to. So this is not part of you. This is why we use the word transcendental. And now we've left science completely behind, okay? Or, I mean, there's some scientific arguments that can be made, but they're not, I don't think they're anywhere near convincing enough. It's like you can MacGyver it together and it may be correct, but we're far from any kind of scientific proof of what we're talking about now. Mm-hmm. So all knowledge exists in this kind of divine collective consciousness weird thing. And when we tap into that is when we get these right answers. So the less ego we have, the easier it is to tap into that. And the really interesting thing is that the text that I happened to read the night that our stream got flubbed was talking about particular techniques to directly tap into that. So this text is specifically about, there's many complicated ways to tap into it. You can do yoga, you can do pranayama, you can do different kinds of meditation practices, but there are direct ways to get on, like tap into it just directly without all of these steps. And the essence of that is, it's going to sound weird, is in the in-between spaces. So if you pay attention to your experience of life, what you will probably discover, what I've discovered, what a lot of people I've worked with have discovered, is that, you have a thought, and then you have a thought, and you have a thought. And then you can also have an emotion, you can have an emotion, you can have an emotion. But if you pay attention to your mind, there is a quiet space in between thoughts. There is a quiet space in between emotions. And that third space, I would hypothesize for you, Thor, is accessed in those quiet spaces. It is not the result of logic. It is between logic and it is between emotion.
Yep. I could see that. No, that makes complete sense to me, actually.
So can you explain that to us?
Because I don't ever feel like I'm pushing down my logic and emotion. I'm not reining it in or telling it to step aside for a moment. It's like there's a breathe in and a breathe out. There's a moment where it's like, okay, it's this, now logic, emotion, now it's this, now it's logic, emotion, whatever. It's taking turns, but there's never any type of I need to force myself to do this. It just happens, right?
So it's funny the language that you used, because that is actually the technique, is to catch this. It's cool. This is it's weird. So so if you're trying to look for the in between space, there are a couple things you can do. First is when we meditate, generally speaking, our goal is to stop, create a cessation of thoughts.
Yep.
And so if you have no thoughts and no emotions and you're just present, if you're in that Thuriya state of consciousness without mental activity, you're just focused. This is kind of like flow. Flow is on on the track to this place. But flow still has mental activity. So what we try to do in meditation is we widen the in-between space, right? So if we say thought, nothing, thought, nothing, thought, nothing. And if we look at our suffering correlates with a very, very tiny gap. So if you look at something like a panic attack, the subjective experience of a panic attack is one thought leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. There's no space in between them. There's no relief. A thought loop is also, we're going to cycle through these 15 thoughts, and we're going to cycle again, we're going to cycle again. There's no gap. Meditation is the exact opposite. We are trying to increase the gap between our thoughts and our emotions. The really interesting thing about what you described is that the other formal way to practice this is to find the gap between inhalation and exhalation. So breathing in and breathing out is a very natural thing where there's directionality in one place, there's directionality in another place. So you have to move through an inflection point every time you breathe. There is an inflection point between thought and thought number one and thought number two. There's an inflection point between happiness and sadness. There's an inflection point between breathing in and breathing out. There's an inflection point between being awake and falling asleep. So in all of these inflection points, it is in the inflection point that the magic happens. And if anyone wants to free themselves from thought, emotion, ego, and they want to follow your path, Thor, they need to sit in the in-between spaces.
I think that's really hard for most people to conceptualize, if that makes sense.
Yes, it is very hard for. So the tradition that I'm drawing from is Shambhava Yoga, which is a very, very rigorous and difficult technique. So it is like straight onto the highway, so it's hard to do, but it is absolutely possible. They also describe it as a choiceless awareness. So choice, and this is where, like, I don't know, I think this will resonate to you as well. Like, you don't really make a choice. The choice sort of gets made and you follow it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And like, this is where I don't think many people will understand that. But the more that you do this, the more that it just becomes what it is. There's no choice to be made. There's no choice about the ferret rescue. It's just, it is to be done.
It's happening.
It is happening. It is right. It is, period.
It's funny too, because people will be like, how do you choose things? How do you choose to do things so fast? I always have to like wait on it. I was like, it's already chosen.
Yes. Yes. I can tell. So I think Shambhava Yoga is what you're doing. So I don't even know, I don't need to do anything for you. You're doing it.
All right.
If you want more detail, we can go into more detail at some point about practices and stuff like that. Like, we're actually doing something on the membership side this month about developing a meditation practice. But so I think that, like, this choiceless awareness, I'm not surprised. I think it's very confusing for a lot of people. Like, what do you mean I don't choose? No, the choice.
Yeah. I mean, it's been confusing for anybody that I've talked to. Yeah. Pretty much my whole life over. Like, people I meet in real life, people I know online, like, it doesn't make any sense. And they're just like, what? Like, what do you mean you just do things? And it's like, I just do things, Yeah.
I get you. So my experience of it is that I oscillate between choosing things and choiceless awareness. The more my ego activates, the more emotional I get, the more that state of mind happens, then I feel paralyzed. I don't know what the right choice is. The whole point is, like, what's really cool about this is, like, once you operate from Thuriya, there is no choice. It just happens.
It's not even, I guess it's even the thing. It's like, it's not even that I do things. It's that things are happening.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a weird way to describe it, but that makes the most sense.
And I know it's hard for people to understand. At the same time, I think that every person who is listening to this has experienced what we are talking about. They have had a moment in their life where things became clear, and then it was how do we make this happen, as opposed to right choice, wrong choice. Or it wasn't about it being the right choice or the wrong choice. You abandon the concept of right or wrong, and you just do the thing. You kind of know, like, deep within you that this is to be done. You kind of know it feels right.
It kind of reminds me of
what?
Sometimes crisis situations.
Mm-hmm.
When there's a crisis situation, you just do without thinking. You just do. Your brain goes, it's not even your brain. It's, this needs to happen. I'm doing this. That crisis situation feels, it's not the same, but it feels similar in that way, where it's, this is happening. We're doing this. And the other parts of your brain go, how do we do it? And then they figure out how to do it. And then you do it.
It's a beautiful analogy. The challenge is that when some people enter crisis, there's two kinds of modes in crisis, that with ego and without ego. So when you are in a crisis and your ego is active, then it's the very opposite. It is absolute torture. Because you're like, what will happen? This will mean this, and then this will happen to me, and then this will happen to me, and this will happen to me. And then you spiral out of control, you feel overwhelmed, and the crisis crushes you. The flip side is you're in a situation like what Thor is describing, where you remove the ego from the equation, right? In the absence of ego, then suddenly you go into like, Chad mode, where you're just like, you're crushing it and it needs to be done. And you don't worry about the fact that it may not work out. Like, it may not work out. You just accept that and you have to act. And
so an interesting thing about that too, actually, that one, I've had that many, many times in crisis situations, especially when, there's like an emergency with the rescue or something like that. And it doesn't mean you don't have emotions. You just have them afterwards. A lot of the times I've found where it's like, I need to put this one to the side because it's going to cause a problem right now. And it's like, I've decided, this is what needs to happen. We figured out how to do this. And if I break down right now, none of this is going to work. So it's like, in this instance, I need to wait, right? This needs to wait, whatever that is. And I've had that happen a number of times.
Yeah, so that's very common in medicine too. So when we're dealing with crisis situations, we have a specific process. We tell everyone, set your emotions aside for now, and then we'll do debriefs. So we'll do post-mortem debriefs and things like that. Like we have time and space to let that emotion come back into your life, which, by the way, is a very useful technique to apply for normal people, which I don't think we do enough. We don't set aside space for our emotions in a particular formalized way, which means that they have to it's like if I'm inviting my neighbors over for a Christmas party once a year, they don't have to show up randomly to see me. Like, you can set aside a time and space for something to happen. And when you give that space for that thing to happen, it's beautiful what your brain does. So another great example of this is sometimes like when I'm working with patients, right, as a psychiatrist doing psychotherapy and stuff like that. I'll ask them sometimes they'll notice something really interesting, which is that their life is getting better, but every time they come to therapy, they feel worse. And they're like, I don't understand. Like, I feel so bad. Like, I'm fucking here crying, but like my life is fine. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly how it works. What you've learned how to do is you used to cry every single day. And now you've learned how to push it all aside, come here, take out the trash, and then like your trash can is empty for the rest of the week. And you pile up that, you come here and then you feel bad. And they're like, oh. And I was like, we can continue like if this, and then the cool thing is even that stops eventually. Like they like once they figure that out, I don't teach them that. They have to figure it out.
Human garbage collection. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what we are. We're trash compactors,
Yep.
Yeah.
I found that to be useful sometimes. Like it's definitely a tool kind of in that belt where understanding when it is healthy to move that to the side to handle that crisis situation, but not to keep that permanently aside. That's not good for you at all.
Yep.
And I've had a number of situations like that. We had one, Vinny, one of the ferrets that came in. Owner was like, oh yeah, he hasn't eaten in 2 days. Get there, he's half the weight that a ferret his age should be. The owner is very clearly on meth. So house reeks of it. Horrible. Had to file a police report, do all that kind of stuff. And it was just grim, man. Like, it just really messed me up. But it was like, in this moment, these are the things that need to happen. Animal has I have to put on the happy face, be like, oh, everything's okay. Get the animal from the person. Make sure that everything feels good. Call the police, file the police report, put all the evidence in front of that. Get the animal home, figure out what we're going to do. Start finding a way to make him so that if you have a person, even any mammal, actually, that is not eaten in a certain amount of time, and you try to give them a full meal, they actually go into shock and they die.
Yeah.
It's a horrible thing. And
refeeding syndrome.
Yeah, refeeding syndrome. That's exactly what it is. So we had to figure out exactly what levels of food can he eat over that amount of time to prevent refeeding syndrome because he would just like his vitals would crash and he'd die. So trying to figure all that stuff out, and then, okay, everything is handled. Let's go sit in the car and eat a pie and cry. You know?
Yeah. No, I mean,
yeah. You know?
I think it's a huge problem that I think people, you know, we push the emotion to the side, which I agree with you is healthy, but then you've got to pay that price.
You have to. Yeah.
Right. You can't dodge your karma. Like that debt needs to be paid, and you need to feel that negative emotion.
Yeah, no, yeah. And I've gotten very good, I think, at knowing when it's okay to push that. You know, it's like it's only in a very critical situation, like a really critical, like something could die. There's no coming back from the failure on this one. You could fail, sure, and you might learn something from it, but there's something that will break that cannot be unbroken in those situations. That's like, okay, now it's time to push this aside for a moment, handle it, you know. And like you said, with medicine, it's the same.
I would say I would add one thing to that. So I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
And I think that you can't discredit your ability to deal with it later. So the ability to set something aside is way easier when your brain knows that we can deal with this later and it won't be catastrophic. A lot of problems that I see with people are that they keep setting it aside, and then they don't know that they don't have confidence that they can deal with it when they open that basement door that's full of negativity, right? It can feel so incredibly overwhelming. And that can also become kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more that you let things pile up, the more objectively overwhelming they are when you try to tackle them. So then you feel overwhelmed, and so then you let things pile up more because you can't deal with it. And the reason you keep on letting it pile up is because you can't deal with it. And then the more you let it pile up, the more impossible it becomes to deal with. And so that's where, like, oftentimes professional help, like with a medical professional, can really go a long way. Like, so we're really good at helping people deal with unsolvable things.
Yeah, I remember when I was younger, that kind of felt like a pressure cooker. You know, it's like it just keeps building up, and you're like, I don't even want to let steam off that; it could explode. You know, I'm just gonna leave it over there, right? And then you get another pressure cooker and another one. Then you're just, and it. What I didn't realize at the time is, like, it's not just like you're putting something in a cabinet somewhere and walking away. You're maintaining that thing. There's energy that goes into keeping that pressure cooker pressurized, right? Every day you're like, I'm just going to spend, maybe I'm only spending 5%. Well, maybe it's only 10%. Maybe it's 15%, until you're just buried with this spinning plate maintenance that you have going on. And then you don't know what to do with the damn thing, right? And that's, I've felt that before in my life. And I basically got to a point where it was like, you have to let the pressure off, and just, sometimes that's awful. Sometimes it's horrible going through that. But if you don't, then you're going to be maintaining that and paying taxes on it all the time.
Absolutely.
You know?
It's debilitating. So one of the three biggest willpower drains is emotional suppression. So the more emotions that you're constantly suppressing, like, it's amazing how people don't realize. So people will, like, look for motivation, they'll look for drive, they'll look for passion, they'll look for, like, discipline. And literally, like, all you need to do is unburden yourself of all of your emotional suppression, because just the maintenance, it's like your inventory is full and then you can't loot anything. Like, you're like, how do I pick up this nice epic piece of loot? You can't, because everything's full. Yeah. So maybe that's not the best analogy, but, like, there's a mana maintenance cost. Huh?
Yeah. It's like endless dailies, so you don't get the raid.
Sure.
Yeah. Same kind of a thing.
Right?
Yeah.
You're just grinding for the same old crap and not really making progress, and you just have to unburden your mind.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think that's the scariest thing too, is that moment when you realize, like, oh, it's coming out and there's nothing I can do about it now. And, like, that's a scary thing, especially if you haven't practiced that. You know, you haven't gotten used to feeling those types of emotions, or even the fear of allowing yourself to feel that way, or looking vulnerable to others, not realizing that that's okay. And even then, the idea that maybe you do make yourself vulnerable to somebody else and you do let those emotions out and they reject it. You know, there's so many fears that go along with that. And I could totally get that. And yeah, that's just like everybody else. I went through the same things throughout my life. Like, I've gone through the exact same things, and I've just kind of learned that it's okay, right? It's okay to just be like, I'm gonna have a shit time for a minute. You know,
Yeah.
it's fine.
No, I think that even the language of going through something. So I think so many people get stuck because they avoid going through something. They try to prevent it. They try to avoid it. They try to keep it from hurting. They try to practice in secret or solve all their problems so that they don't have to go through it. You know, I'll see this a lot with, you know, people who like just move from one relationship to another and just can't tolerate like being on their own for some amount of time. And like sometimes you just have to go through it. But the whole point of going through it is you end up on the other side, but you can't end up on the other side until you go through it.
Yeah. I think the one caveat to that is I found you have to avoid circular thinking in that, where it's like, this is bad, so everything's going to be bad, because this is bad, so everything's bad. The moment you start feeling those emotions, it's really easy to be like, everything is awful. And it's like, no, you can feel these so that later you don't have to feel them in the same way, or they don't have to define who you are. You don't have to spend the maintenance on that anymore. You can be different afterwards, and that's okay. You know, like that was something that I had to work through as well, was like realizing like it doesn't define who you are as a person. You know?
Yeah, so I think there's a very important thing there about, see, when we experience negative emotion, what really screws us is the identity-based conclusions that come from a temporary elevated emotion.
Yep.
So like when we feel a lot of negative emotion, we can form a conclusion. And then the problem is that conclusion stays with us even when the emotion goes away. So that's where, like, you know, and I think you're speaking to, you maybe used to do that more and now you do it less. You recognize that even if you have negative thoughts in this moment, those negative thoughts are not necessarily true for all time. They don't make a determination about you.
Yeah, that doesn't hit me like that at all anymore. I think when I was much younger, it was like, yeah, I mean, I think everybody has those thoughts growing up, though. It's like, oh, no, they don't like me. My whole life is over.
Yeah.
You know, like, I got an F. My whole life is over. It's like, I think as you get older, you realize very quickly, you're like, maybe that permanent record really wasn't that big of a deal. You know, it's like, maybe I'll still be a person afterwards, and it doesn't really define me, you know?
I love that phrase, permanent record, because like we get terrified. I remember being terrified too of stuff going on my permanent record, but I don't think anyone reads the permanent record. Like no one reads the permanent record at school. Like I don't know.
What's going on your permanent record? It's like,
you know, it's like when you apply to university. Like I thought they were going to send my permanent record, but you literally just request transcripts.
Yep.
That's it. That's it. There's no transmission of the school is too dysfunctional. And the university doesn't have the administrative bandwidth to look at everyone's permanent record. Or so, you know, it's like, it's weird. I mean, sometimes you can get stuff like in med school and things like that. You've got certain, you know, yes or no questions and jobs where they ask you, like, have you ever broken a law or whatever? But yeah, I think it's like one of the biggest skills, and I think it's a skill that has to be learned. So the other challenge is that people can look at you and they can say, oh, like, I wish I was like Thor, but you're a finished product. You're not, or somewhat finished. Your version 2.0, let's say.
Full release.
Right? And that's a skill. The ability to separate, tease apart, I am feeling this way now versus this is like an ego-based conclusion that I carry with me, is like, that's huge. So just feel the negativity and wait 24 hours to form conclusions about yourself. That's what I would like strongly recommend.
Yeah, I mean, to be real with you, I don't even see it as like full release or anything like that. Like, I'm going to be learning stuff the rest of my life. And that's a pretty cool place to be. Mm-hmm. Like quite frankly, it's neat. And the way that I generally see it is, me as a person gets to learn who me as a person is over the rest of my life. And that means I get to learn about the things that I'm good at, learn about the things that I'm bad at, learn about things that I can improve, learn about things that, you know, maybe I don't want to do. And I get to be along for that ride. That's a pretty cool story, man. And I don't even know what it is yet. So I get to read it the whole time. That's how I've always felt about this stuff for a long time. And it's neat because it's like it's all discovery. The whole thing is discovery, you know? Yeah, I really enjoy that.
Yeah, I'd strongly encourage you, Thor, to spend some time in the in-between spaces, because I think that's where some of the coolest discovery happens.
Oh yeah, no, I can totally understand that. It's funny when the way that you were describing that is something I like to do quite a lot. Is just kind of take away any type of tasks that I have, take away any type of social obligation or technology or anything that's in the way, and just kind of let myself think about stuff. And I find that that's kind of rare in today. There's too much doom scrolling, and like I have to stay on social media, and I have to do these things like and then you do that until you pass out, and you wake up with your phone stuck to your face. You know, like just giving yourself even just 20 minutes a day to just stare into the middle distance and figure out who you are is crazy beneficial.
I completely agree. So I think we see that. It's interesting you bring up technology, because technology is destroying our in-between spaces.
I completely agree with that.
It is taking away, more than anything else, it is taking away our time with ourselves.
Yeah.
So what I really love doing, and like one of my best productivity hacks, is pacing. Like not listening to music, not listening to a podcast, just pacing. When I don't feel like working, I get up and pace, and then oftentimes when I'm done pacing, I'm ready to work. And
it's kind of funny because I think there's a number of people that do that in video games, as odd as that is. Like run around in a circle in Dalaran. They're not really doing anything. They're just kind of like running around in a circle in Dalaran doing nothing, right? Not thinking about anything. That's a common thing. Yeah, pacing in games is a very common thing. How many of you guys ran around in a circle in Dalaran or Orgrimmar or Stormwind?
There's so many. The city is huge, though. They just
running in a circle.
And
Look
they
at all the
don't
people
do
in
anything?
chat. Nope. They're not even waiting for a raid. They're not waiting for anything. It's just like, I'm just going to run around in a circle. There's a lot of people that do this. It's very common behavior. I've done it too.
I've never done that.
You'd be really surprised like how many people have done it. That's really common.
All of chat is saying that they do it.
Yeah.
So what's going through your head? Are you like...
Nothing. Sometimes nothing.
Wow.
You're just kind of gone. And you're just like, I'm just going to run in a circle for a little bit. Sometimes you'll be talking to someone. Sometimes there's just nothing going on. Some people just like doing that sometimes. And I think that is sort of that in-between space where technology is still involved. But you really only see that a lot of the times in multiplayer games that have downtime areas, which are areas that are intended to be when you're not doing anything, like sitting in town. It's kind of interesting.
That's so wild.
Yeah, WoW therapy, exactly. GTA 5. Yeah, people are talking about the same thing.
Yeah, GTA 5 I can kind of understand. GTA 5 is a game that I feel like you can just absorb the ambiance of the game.
Yeah. Pre-game Overwatch. That's another good example. It's just that jumping back and forth left to right, that walking in a circle in that area. It's areas where there's it's areas where there is no objective and you are not currently tasked with doing anything, and you just kind of turn off for a little bit.
That's really interesting.
Do repetitive action. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Thor, any last thoughts or questions? I mean, I know we've covered a lot of ground today and, a couple days ago.
No, I think this is awesome, man. And I always have a blast coming and talking to you.
Likewise.
Honestly. Yeah, it's super nice.
Yeah, I think it's... I really enjoy talking to you. I think it's like really interesting to hear your... It feels to me like you've attained a very high rank without following a meta that I've been religiously following. So I'm so... And like that's what's cool about this is like I don't think you need to learn this. You can discover it. So I really like listening to your experience of stuff. I think your impact on the community is hugely beneficial. And it's so interesting to look at what you do through the lens of what I've learned. Because I see a lot of these mechanisms of even the way that you talk to your community. I'm not surprised at all that people in your community do incredibly well. Because I think whether you realize it or not, you're basically dissolving their ego for them, right?
I didn't realize that was what was going on.
Yeah, that's the biggest effect. I mean, I don't know if it's the biggest, but like that's what I see, right? So even the ability to fail is ego-oriented. Reframing the way that you look at things to remove ego. And I think that's why people see this explosion of like progress. Because once the ego gets the fuck out of the way, like I want you all to just think about this for a second. When you're living your life, you oftentimes know what the right thing to do is. You know that you're smart enough. You know that you need to do these sequence of steps. But something within you holds you back. And we think it's willpower, we think it's a lack of discipline, we think whatever. But no, if you really pay attention, it is going to be your perception of yourself. What will people think? It'll hurt if I fail. It'll be you telling yourself not to proceed because of X, Y, Z. And if you really look at it, okay, what is the negative consequence that you're worried about? Your mind doesn't think about it logically because it doesn't think, oh, like this is a game jam. It's not like this goes on my permanent record, right? Like the thought is absurd. But your logic does not function properly. There is some kind of fear or avoidance of emotion, which, by the way, the ego and negative emotion are very tied hand in hand. Right? So like just the more you remove yourself from the equation, because what's holding you back, it's you. Remove yourself from the equation and you'll start to fly. You're really what's weighing you down. And it's like amazing how you've learned that for yourself, internalized it, applied it, and now you teach it to other people, which I think is super cool.
Well, thank you. And I think the thing that I really enjoy about it is, like I said before, I like solving puzzles. And sometimes person's biggest puzzle is them, you know. And
I think it's almost always them.
It's always them. So when someone brings me a puzzle like that, the best thing that I try to do for that is to see how does this person feel in that situation? Because you can't really tell someone like you should feel this way, but you can be like, try to understand how they feel in the position that they're in with the understanding they have. And the more information that I receive about the person, the more that I can understand like how they feel, why they feel that way, the things that they're working with, the easier it is to sort of form that mental image of who they are. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, well, how would I break out of that if I was in that position? And then try to hand them that, you know, and be like, this might work, you know?
Yeah. So I think that there's a subtle, really important thing in that answer, which is that, see, when someone loses confidence in themselves, they have all these beliefs, right? And then I think the key thing is that a lot of the default thinking is like, oh, this person is wrong. So I see that a lot when I'm working with people who are suicidal, who are like, you know, I have no reason to live. And the right answer isn't, hey, here are all the reasons you should live. That's invalidating. Also doesn't help you understand their situation.
Yep.
The right answer is to add more to the equation, right? It's not to try to remove the negative necessarily. Like that can be done, definitely. That's important over time. We want to do that. But the first thing to do is like add more information. And when I see that a lot of people are like, oh, I'm a loser because of X, Y, Z, right? And you can't change your past, but you can add additional experiences to your life that will change what's on the right side of the equal sign.
Yep.
And the real tragedy is that when we feel like we're losers, we stop adding more experience. Oh, I had this one terrible relationship and now I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life, because you won't have other relationships. And that's what's so paralyzing about it, is the very thing that will solve the problem is like doing the thing that you don't want to do is exactly what you need to do to fix the problem.
Yep. It's funny because I drill that down as like a single phrase a lot of the times. It doesn't always apply, but when it does, I think it's quite funny. Is someone will be like, "Oh, I'm not a good artist. I'm not a good artist. I'm never going to be a good artist." And I was like, "No, you're not a good artist yet."
Yeah.
And that single word reframes the whole thing.
Absolutely.
It's like, oh, wait a minute. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's not about convincing someone. No, you actually like you're such a great artist. Oh my god, your art is great. And it's like
they'll just be like, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
Like you're lying to me now. I don't trust anything you say.
Absolutely.
But
right.
like, so, no, your art sucks right now, but you're not a great artist yet. It's fine.
It's wild, but this reminds me of a sociopath that I once worked with, who was like, you know, and they were like, you know, I'm a sociopath, and I was like, yeah. I was like, what are you going to do about it? Right? I'm not going to convince you otherwise. Like, yes, that is correct. But what does that mean about your future? It isn't deterministic. And some of the best people that I know are sociopaths. They make a very conscious, non-emotional decision that like, I'm going to live a good life. And I'm going to add value to the people around me. And that is the way that I want to live. So just because you are something today doesn't mean that you have to be that thing tomorrow. It is the nature of life. And forget about humans. Life to adapt, to grow, to survive, to improve. That's what life does. That's what separates it from non-life. All right. Are you streaming? Because I'll raid you.
I am not.
Okay.
If you'd like You could raid the ferrets though.
Okay,
They
let's
exist.
raid the ferrets. I am going to do this. Okay, where are the ferrets?
It is Ferret software. I will link you the channel. Here you go. They are currently in food mode, but they're in the cage in sleep time. So they sleep 18 hours a day. Yeah, for those who don't know, the ferret rescues run completely off of ad revenue. So everything that we do for them, all of the medical everything, is all done from ads. You don't have to sub or throw bits or anything. It's just watching the stream does it.
We are raiding.
Hell yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on, Thor. Good luck on your
Always.
journey. Spend some time. And for those of y'all that are like paying attention, like spend some time in the in-between spaces. If you want to connect that transcendent weird, maybe it's just subconscious and epigenetic memory. Fair enough. But that seems to be what works. And take care, y'all. Thank you all very much for coming today. I'm raiding. Okay, I have successfully raided. So then I will stop streaming. And take care, buddy. Thank you so much for coming today.